This is the true story of the Tsavo man-eaters, two maneless lions that used to kill the construction workers. They are estimated to have eaten 30 to 135 workers. The relentless African sun beat down upon the red earth of Tsavo as Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson wiped the sweat from his brow and surveyed the sprawling railway construction site before him. March 1898 had brought him to this desolate corner of British East Africa, where the Uganda Railway was slowly carving its way through some of the most inhospitable terrain on the continent. The ambitious project, dubbed the Lunatic Line by its critics back in London, aimed to connect the port of Mombasa to the inland reaches of Uganda, opening up the interior for trade and colonial administration. Patterson, a seasoned engineer and soldier in the British Army, had been tasked with overseeing the construction of a bridge across the Tsavo River. At 31 years of age, he possessed the weathered appearance of a man accustomed to frontier life, his lean frame hardened by years of military service in India, and his keen eyes reflecting the practical intelligence that had earned him his commission. The Irish-born officer had already proven himself capable of managing large-scale engineering projects under challenging conditions, but nothing in his previous experience had prepared him for what awaited him in the thorn-scrubbed wilderness of Tsavo. The landscape surrounding the construction site presented a harsh and unforgiving vista. Vast stretches of thorny acacia trees dotted the semi-arid plains, their gnarled branches reaching toward the merciless sky like the desperate fingers of the damned. The Tsavo River, though providing essential water for the construction effort, meandered through the region as little more than a seasonal watercourse, its banks lined with dense vegetation that offered perfect concealment for the myriad dangerous creatures that called this place home. The very name Tsavo derived from the local Kamba word meaning place of slaughter, a designation that would prove grimly prophetic in the months to come. These men had signed contracts to work on the railway project for wages that seemed substantial by Indian standards, though the reality of life in the African bush quickly disabused many of their initial optimism. The coolie camps stretched along the construction line in a series of canvas tents and temporary structures, creating an impromptu town that moved gradually westward as the rails advanced mile by mile through the wilderness. The men toiled under the scorching sun to clear vegetation, level the ground, lay ballast, and position the heavy iron rails that would carry the trains of the future. The construction site buzzed with constant activity as teams of workers coordinated their efforts under the watchful eyes of British and Indian supervisors. Steam-powered machinery supplemented human labor where possible, but much of the work still required the application of raw human strength and endurance. The sound of hammers ringing against metal, the scrape of shovels against stone, and the shouts of foremen directing their crews created a symphony of industrial progress that echoed across the African landscape from dawn until dusk. Insects swarmed in countless varieties, spreading disease and making life miserable for men already pushed to their physical limits. The threat of tropical illnesses hung over the camps like a sword of Damocles, with malaria, dysentery, and other ailments claiming lives with depressing regularity. Wild animals posed an additional hazard, as elephants occasionally trampled through the camps. Rhinoceros charged work crews that ventured too close to their territory, and various species of antelope and other game animals attracted predators of every description. Patterson established his headquarters in a substantial tent near the center of the main camp, from which he could coordinate the various aspects of the construction project. His quarters reflected the dual nature of his position as both engineer and military officer, with surveying equipment and construction plans sharing space with rifles, ammunition, and other implements of frontier defense. The tent was surrounded by a low earthwork and thorn fence, a modest fortification that provided some measure of security against the nocturnal dangers that prowled the African night. The routine of camp life followed the rhythms dictated by the climate and the demands of the work. The men rose before dawn to take advantage of the cooler morning hours, when the most strenuous labor could be accomplished with less risk of heat exhaustion. The middle hours of the day were reserved for tasks that could be performed in whatever shade was available, while the late afternoon brought a resumption of heavy work as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Evenings were devoted to meal preparation, equipment maintenance, and the various administrative tasks necessary to keep such a large operation functioning smoothly. The Indian workers had brought their own cultural traditions and dietary practices to the African camps, creating a unique fusion of Eastern and African influences. Cooking fires sent columns of smoke into the evening air as the men prepared their simple meals of rice, lentils, and whatever meat could be obtained through hunting or trade with local tribes. The aroma of curry spices mingled with the smoke from countless small fires, creating an olfactory signature that marked the presence of the railway construction camps from miles away. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter throughout the night, their rifles loaded and ready for any emergency. The guards were recruited from among the more experienced workers and supplemented by a small contingent of askaris, African soldiers trained and equipped by the British colonial administration. These men knew the sounds and signs of the African night, understanding which nocturnal noises represented normal wildlife activity and which might herald the approach of something more sinister. Patterson himself maintained a rigorous schedule that combined his engineering responsibilities with the leadership duties demanded by his position as the senior British officer in the region. His days began with an inspection of the overnight progress reports and security briefings from the guard commanders. This was followed by a tour of the active work sites, where he consulted with his subordinate engineers and foremen to address any technical challenges that had arisen. The afternoon hours were typically devoted to planning and administrative work, as Patterson coordinated with supply caravans, corresponded with his superiors in Nairobi and London, and managed the complex logistics of maintaining a large workforce in the middle of the African wilderness. The bridge construction itself presented formidable engineering challenges that tested Patterson's considerable skills. The Tsavo River, though not particularly wide, required a substantial structure capable of supporting the weight of fully loaded trains while withstanding the seasonal floods that could transform the normally placid watercourse into a raging torrent. The foundation work demanded careful excavation and the precise placement of massive stone piers, while the superstructure required the assembly of prefabricated iron sections that had been shipped from Britain and transported overland from the coast. The arrival of supply caravans provided welcome breaks in the routine of camp life, bringing fresh provisions, mail from home, and news from the outside world. These caravans, composed of hundreds of porters carrying loads on their heads or backs, represented the sole connection between the construction camps and civilization. The porters themselves were drawn from various East African tribes, each group bringing its own customs and expertise to the complex task of moving supplies across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. The sight of a supply caravan approaching across the plains was invariably greeted with enthusiasm by the workers, who eagerly anticipated any break in their monotonous diet and any news from the world beyond Tsavo. Communication with the outside world depended entirely on these irregular supply caravans and the occasional official courier. Letters to and from family members in India could take months to reach their destinations, creating a sense of isolation that weighed heavily on many of the workers. Patterson himself maintained an extensive correspondence with his wife and colleagues, but even his official reports to his superiors were subject to the vagaries of African transportation and could take weeks to reach their intended recipients. The local African population maintained a cautious relationship with the railway construction project. Some tribes provided labor and guidance to the construction crews, while others remained aloof or actively hostile to the foreign intrusion into their traditional territories. The Wakamba people, who inhabited much of the Tsavo region, had developed a complex relationship with the various wild animals that shared their homeland, and their knowledge of local wildlife behavior would prove invaluable in the trials that lay ahead. As the month of March drew to a close, Patterson could reflect with satisfaction on the progress that had been achieved since his arrival. The bridge foundations were taking shape according to schedule, and the morale of the workforce remained generally positive despite the harsh conditions. The various challenges of disease, dangerous wildlife, and logistical complications had been met and overcome through careful planning and vigorous leadership. The railway project was advancing steadily westward, bringing the dream of a transcontinental connection 1 mile closer to reality with each passing day. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent success, subtle signs of trouble were beginning to manifest themselves. Several workers had reported strange sounds emanating from the darkness beyond the camp perimeter during the night hours. The guard spoke of unusual animal tracks discovered near the camps each morning, tracks that seemed larger and more numerous than those typically left by the local wildlife. Some of the more superstitious workers had begun to mutter about evil spirits and cursed lands, their fears fueled by whispered conversations with local tribal members who spoke of ancient dangers that dwelt in the thorny wilderness of Tsavo. Patterson dismissed these concerns as the natural anxieties of men far from home, working under dangerous conditions in an alien environment. His practical mind focused on the tangible challenges of engineering and logistics, rather than the vague fears and superstitions that seemed to multiply in the African darkness. The lieutenant colonel had faced dangerous wildlife before during his service in India, and he possessed both the weapons and the experience necessary to deal with any animal threats that might arise. His confidence in his ability to protect his men and complete his mission remained unshaken as the calendar turned from March to April, bringing with it the first hints of the nightmare that was about to descend upon the Tsavo construction camps. The railway project continued its relentless advance through the thorn-scrubbed landscape, carrying with it the hopes and ambitions of an empire that sought to impose its will upon one of the last untamed corners of the earth. Neither Patterson nor his men could have imagined that they were about to encounter an adversary unlike any they had previously faced, an enemy that would transform their engineering project into a desperate struggle for survival and establish the name of Tsavo as a byword for terror throughout the British Empire. The morning of April 11, 1898, dawned with the same relentless heat that had become synonymous with life in the Tsavo construction camps. Patterson emerged from his tent at his customary early hour, expecting to begin another day of routine inspections and engineering challenges. The familiar sounds of the awakening camp filled the air as the Indian coolies stirred from their slumber and began the process of preparing for another day of back-breaking labor under the African sun. Cook fires were being kindled, water was being fetched from the river, and the various foremen were assembling their work crews for the day's assignments. The lieutenant colonel had barely completed his morning ablutions when Dalgarens, one of his section engineers, approached his tent with an expression of grave concern etched across his weather-beaten features. The man's usual composure had been replaced by an obvious agitation that immediately captured Patterson's attention. Dalgarens reported that one of the Indian workers, a coolie named Ungan Singh, had failed to report for his assigned duties at the bridge construction site. This absence was particularly noteworthy because Singh had established a reputation as one of the most reliable and punctual workers in the entire camp. Patterson accompanied Dalgarens to Singh's tent, which was located in the section of the camp designated for the bridge construction crew. The tent stood silent and motionless in the growing light of dawn, its canvas walls showing no signs of movement or occupancy. The surrounding area appeared normal at first glance, with other workers going about their morning routines without any apparent awareness that anything was amiss. However, a closer examination of the ground around Singh's tent revealed disturbing evidence that something extraordinary had occurred during the night. The tent itself showed clear signs of damage, with tears in the canvas that had obviously been made by something with sharp claws. Most ominously, a trail of disturbed earth and vegetation led away from the tent toward the dense bush that surrounded the construction site. This trail was marked by dark stains that could only be blood, creating an unmistakable record of some terrible event that had unfolded while the camp slept. Patterson ordered an immediate and thorough search of the area around the tent, directing several of his most experienced men to follow the trail that led into the bush. The lieutenant colonel himself took charge of examining the tent and its immediate surroundings, applying the methodical approach that had served him well in his military career. The evidence painted a horrifying picture of what had transpired during the dark hours before dawn. The interior of the tent showed clear signs of a violent intrusion. Singh's few personal possessions were scattered about the small space, and his sleeping mat bore dark stains that confirmed the worst fears of the search party. The tears in the tent walls were too large and too regular to have been made by any tool or weapon. Instead, they suggested the work of massive claws capable of rending the heavy canvas with ease. Most disturbing of all, there was no sign of Singh himself, either within the tent or in the immediate vicinity. The trail leading from the tent into the bush told its own grim story. The searchers followed the clear marks of something large being dragged through the thorny vegetation, noting how the branches had been broken and bent to accommodate the passage of whatever had seized the unfortunate coolie. The blood trail continued for several hundred yards into increasingly dense undergrowth, where the thorny acacia trees and tangled vines made further progress extremely difficult for human pursuers. As the search party pushed deeper into the bush, they began to encounter signs that made even the most experienced among them pause with growing unease. Massive paw prints were clearly visible in the soft earth, prints that dwarfed those of any lion that any of the men had previously encountered. The spacing and depth of these tracks suggested an animal of extraordinary size and power, something that moved with the confidence of an apex predator that feared nothing in its domain. Approximately half a mile from the camp, the searchers made a discovery that confirmed their worst fears. In a small clearing surrounded by dense thorn bushes, they found the scattered remains of what had once been Ungan Singh. The scene was one of such horror that several of the search party members were overcome with nausea and had to withdraw from the immediate area. The evidence made it clear that the coolie had been killed and partially consumed by some kind of large carnivore, though the nature and extent of the damage suggested a level of savagery that went beyond normal predatory behavior. Patterson examined the scene with the clinical detachment of a military officer, though even his experienced eyes were shocked by the brutality of what he witnessed. The arrangement of the remains and the pattern of consumption suggested that the attack had been carried out by more than one animal, and the size of the tooth marks indicated predators of extraordinary proportions. Most disturbing of all was the evidence that the victim had been dragged alive for a considerable distance before being killed, suggesting a deliberate and prolonged ordeal that spoke to an intelligence and cruelty that transcended normal animal behavior. The discovery of Singh's remains sent shockwaves through the construction camp that extended far beyond the immediate grief for a lost comrade. The Indian coolies, already far from home and working under dangerous conditions, found their worst fears about the African wilderness suddenly and violently confirmed. Word of the attack spread through the camp with the speed of wildfire, growing more embellished and terrifying with each retelling. The men spoke in hushed tones of evil spirits and cursed lands, their superstitions inflamed by the undeniable evidence of a threat that conventional wisdom suggested should not exist in their vicinity. Patterson found himself facing a crisis that threatened to undermine the entire construction project. Many of the coolies began to speak of abandoning the project and returning to India, despite the financial penalties and legal complications that such action would entail. The carefully maintained discipline and routine of the construction camps began to show signs of strain as fear took hold of the collective consciousness. The gathering took place in his headquarters tent, where the assembled men discussed the situation with the gravity it deserved. The consensus among the group was that they were dealing with a rogue lion, or lions that had developed a taste for human flesh, a phenomenon that, while rare, was not unknown in the annals of African wildlife behavior. However, the size of the tracks and the boldness of the attack suggested predators of unusual size and aggression. Patterson implemented immediate security measures designed to protect the workforce, while allowing the construction project to continue. The guard details were doubled and armed with the most powerful rifles available to the expedition. Additional sentries were posted around the perimeter of the camps with orders to maintain constant vigilance throughout the night hours. The workers were instructed to sleep in groups and to ensure that their tents were properly secured against intrusion. Most importantly, no one was to venture beyond the immediate vicinity of the camps alone, particularly during the hours of darkness. Despite these precautions, the atmosphere in the camps remained tense and apprehensive as the sun set on that fateful day. The normal sounds of evening activity were subdued as the workers went about their tasks with nervous glances toward the surrounding bush. The guards took their positions with grim determination, knowing that they stood as the thin line of defense between their sleeping comrades and whatever lurked in the African darkness. The cooking fire seemed to burn a little brighter that night, as if the men hoped that light and warmth might provide some protection against the unknown threat that had claimed the life of Ungan Singh. Patterson himself spent much of the night moving between the various guard posts, checking on the readiness of his defenses and providing encouragement to the sentries. The lieutenant colonel carried his favorite rifle, a powerful .33 Lee Enfield that had served him well in previous encounters with dangerous game. His military training had taught him the importance of maintaining calm and confident leadership in the face of crisis, and he was determined to project an image of competence and control that would help steady the nerves of his subordinates. As the hours of darkness stretched on, the camps remained quiet except for the normal sounds of the African night. The guards reported no unusual activity, and the morning of April 12th dawned without incident. However, the relief that greeted the sunrise was tempered by the knowledge that the previous night's calm might represent nothing more than a temporary reprieve. The predator or predators that had killed Singh were still at large, and there was no reason to believe that they would not strike again when the opportunity presented itself. The Indian coolies went about their tasks with constant vigilance, their eyes frequently scanning the surrounding bush for any sign of movement. The supervisors found it necessary to maintain closer oversight of their crews, as the workers tended to cluster together rather than spreading out in the efficient patterns that had previously characterized their labor. Progress on the bridge construction slowed accordingly, though Patterson was determined not to allow fear to completely halt the advance of the railway. The burial of Ungan Singh took place that evening, with appropriate ceremonies conducted according to his religious traditions. The gathering of the entire camp for the funeral served as a somber reminder of the dangers they faced and the price that might be exacted for their presence in this hostile land. Patterson spoke briefly to the assembled workers, acknowledging their loss while expressing his determination to protect them from further harm. The lieutenant colonel's words were translated into the various languages and dialects represented among the workforce, ensuring that his message of resolve and caution reached every man in the camps. As the second night since the attack approached, the enhanced security measures implemented by Patterson remained in full effect. The guards took their positions with the knowledge that they were facing an enemy of unknown capabilities and intentions. The workers retired to their tents with prayers on their lips and weapons close at hand, knowing that their survival might depend on the vigilance of their protectors and the effectiveness of their defenses. Patterson and his men could not have known that they were about to face an ordeal that would test their courage, ingenuity, and determination to limits they had never imagined. The death of Ungan Singh had been merely the opening move in a deadly game that would transform the Tsavo construction camps into a battlefield where the survival of the railway project itself would hang in the balance. The third night following the death of Ungan Singh brought with it an ominous stillness that seemed to press down upon the Tsavo construction camps like a suffocating blanket. Patterson had maintained the enhanced security measures he had implemented after the first attack, but the continued absence of any further incidents had begun to create a false sense of security among some of the workers. The human mind, ever eager to dismiss unpleasant realities, had started to convince many of the coolies that the killing of Singh had been an isolated event, perhaps the work of a lone predator that had since moved on to other hunting grounds. This dangerous complacency was shattered at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening when the night air was suddenly rent by screams of such terror and agony that they seemed to freeze the blood of every man who heard them. The screams emanated from the section of the camp where the permanent way gangs were housed, a cluster of tents situated perhaps 200 yards from Patterson's headquarters. The sound carried clearly across the still night air, conveying a level of mortal terror that left no doubt that another deadly attack was in progress. The lieutenant colonel could see that the guards at their various posts were already moving toward the source of the disturbance, though their response was necessarily cautious, given the darkness and the unknown nature of the threat they were approaching. The screaming continued for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably no more than 30 or 40 seconds before being abruptly cut off in a manner that suggested the worst possible outcome. By the time Patterson and the first guards reached the affected area, an eerie silence had descended over the camp. The only sounds were the confused voices of workers emerging from their tents to investigate the disturbance and the rapid footsteps of men converging on the scene from all directions. The tent from which the screams had originated stood motionless in the darkness, its canvas walls showing no sign of movement or life. The surrounding area appeared normal in the flickering light of the lanterns carried by the approaching rescuers, but experienced eyes could detect subtle signs of disturbance in the arrangement of guy ropes and tent stakes. A closer examination of the tent revealed a scene that was horrifyingly familiar to those who had investigated the disappearance of Ungan Singh. The canvas walls bore fresh tears that could only have been made by massive claws, and the interior of the tent showed clear evidence of a violent struggle. The victim in this case was identified as Pathania, another Indian coolie who had been well regarded by his supervisors and fellow workers. Pathania had simply vanished, and the terrible evidence of the trail leading away from Pathania's tent was even more clearly marked than the one that had followed Singh's disappearance. The soft earth retained perfect impressions of enormous paw prints, prints that confirmed Patterson's growing suspicion that they were dealing with lions of extraordinary size. More disturbing still was the evidence that suggested not one but two separate sets of tracks, indicating that the construction camps were being stalked by a pair of these massive predators working in apparent coordination. Patterson organized an immediate pursuit, though he harbored little hope of catching the attackers before they reached the safety of the dense bush that surrounded the construction site. The lieutenant colonel led a party of armed men along the clear trail left by the predators, their way illuminated by powerful lanterns that cast dancing shadows among the thorny vegetation. The urgency of their mission was underscored by the possibility, however remote, that Pathania might still be alive and in need of rescue. The pursuit led the rescue party through increasingly difficult terrain, as the predators had apparently made straight for the thickest cover available in the vicinity. The thorny acacia bushes tore at the clothing of the pursuers and made rapid movement nearly impossible, while the uneven ground hidden beneath the tangled vegetation posed constant threats of twisted ankles and other injuries. The blood trail remained clearly visible in the beam of the lanterns, providing an unmistakable guide to the route taken by the attackers and their victim. After following the trail for approximately 3/4 of a mile, the searchers came upon a scene that confirmed their worst fears. In a small clearing surrounded by impenetrable thorn thickets, they discovered the remains of Pathania in a condition that was even more disturbing than what they had found of Singh. The evidence suggested that the victim had been alive when dragged from his tent and had endured a prolonged ordeal before finally succumbing to his injuries. The pattern of consumption and the arrangement of the remains indicated the work of two large predators that had fed with a leisure and thoroughness that spoke to their complete confidence in their dominance over this territory. The discovery sent shockwaves through the search party that were immediately transmitted to the entire construction camp upon their return. The realization that they were facing not one but two enormous man-eating lions, and that these predators were hunting with apparent coordination and intelligence, transformed the psychological atmosphere of the camps from nervous apprehension to something approaching panic. The Indian coolies, already stretched to their emotional limits by the harsh conditions of their work, found themselves confronting a threat that exceeded their worst nightmares. Patterson found himself facing a crisis that threatened the very survival of the railway construction project. The morale of the workforce collapsed completely as word of the second attack spread through the camps. Many of the coolies began to speak openly of abandoning the project immediately, regardless of the financial and legal consequences of breaking their contracts. The careful discipline that had previously characterized the construction efforts began to dissolve as fear took precedence over duty and economic necessity. The lieutenant colonel called an emergency meeting of all his officers and senior staff to address the deteriorating situation. The consensus among the group was that they were dealing with a pair of rogue lions that had developed a taste for human flesh and the intelligence to hunt cooperatively in a manner that maximized their chances of success while minimizing their own risk. Patterson implemented a series of emergency measures designed to protect the remaining workers while maintaining the viability of the construction project. The entire camp was reorganized into a more compact and defensible perimeter, with the worker tents clustered more closely together and surrounded by a continuous barrier of thorn bushes and other obstacles. The guard force was further reinforced and equipped with the most powerful weapons available, including several heavy rifles that Patterson had requisitioned for hunting dangerous game. The men were directed to share tents in groups of at least 4, with the understanding that multiple occupants would provide both physical protection and the psychological comfort of companionship during the long and fearful nights. Additional lanterns were distributed throughout the camps to maintain better illumination during the hours of darkness, and strict protocols were established for workers who needed to leave their tents for any reason during the night hours. Despite these precautions, the atmosphere in the camps remained one of barely controlled terror as the workers attempted to continue their duties while constantly watching for signs of the predators that had claimed 2 of their comrades. The efficiency of the construction work suffered dramatically as the coolies found it difficult to concentrate on their tasks while remaining vigilant for potential attacks. The supervisors reported increasing instances of workers refusing to undertake assignments that required them to work in areas that were not in clear sight of the main camp, particularly those that involved venturing near the dense vegetation that provided cover for the hunting lions. Patterson himself took on the role of chief hunter, dedicating significant portions of his time to studying the behavior patterns of the man-eaters and developing strategies for eliminating them. The lieutenant colonel was an experienced hunter who had faced dangerous game in India, but he quickly realized that these Tsavo lions presented challenges unlike any he had previously encountered. Their size, intelligence, and apparent lack of fear of human activity suggested predators that had evolved beyond the normal parameters of lion behavior. The third night following Pathania's death passed without incident, though the silence was more ominous than reassuring to the terrified workers. Patterson and his guards maintained their vigilance throughout the long hours of darkness, knowing that the absence of an attack might simply indicate that the predators were biding their time or selecting their next target with care. As dawn broke on another day in the increasingly embattled construction camps, Patterson reflected on the magnitude of the challenge that confronted him. The railway project represented not merely an engineering endeavor, but a symbol of British imperial power and technological superiority. The failure of the project due to attacks by wild animals would represent a humiliation that would resonate throughout the empire and potentially undermine British prestige in East Africa for years to come. Yet the lieutenant colonel was also acutely aware of his responsibility for the lives of the men under his command. The Indian coolies had traveled thousands of miles from their homes to work on this project, trusting in British promises of protection and fair treatment. The loss of even one more worker to the man-eating lions would represent not only a personal failure on Patterson's part, but a betrayal of the trust that these men had placed in their colonial employers. The stage was set for an escalating confrontation between human determination and animal cunning that would test every aspect of Patterson's leadership and hunting skills. The man-eating lions of Tsavo had established their dominance over the construction camps through 2 successful attacks, and there was every reason to believe that they would continue their predations until either they were eliminated or the railway project was abandoned. The lieutenant colonel understood that the next phase of this deadly game would require him to take the offensive against an enemy that had demonstrated both extraordinary capabilities and an apparently supernatural ability to strike without warning from the concealing darkness of the African night. The morning of April 15th found Patterson standing at the edge of the main construction camp, his weathered hands gripping a pair of field glasses as he surveyed the thorny wilderness that stretched in all directions around the railway site. 3 nights had passed since the killing of Pathania, 3 nights during which the enhanced security measures had succeeded in preventing further attacks, but had done nothing to eliminate the underlying threat that continued to terrorize his workforce. The lieutenant colonel understood that his defensive strategy, while temporarily effective, could not be sustained indefinitely without completely halting the progress of the railway construction. The men went about their assigned tasks with the mechanical efficiency of automatons, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding bush for any sign of movement that might herald the approach of the man-eating lions. Productivity had fallen to a fraction of its previous levels as workers clustered together in groups rather than spreading out in the optimal patterns for efficient construction work. Most seriously, a significant number of the coolies had begun to desert the project entirely, slipping away during the night hours despite the obvious dangers of traveling alone through lion-infested territory. Patterson had reached the inescapable conclusion that the only viable solution to the crisis lay in actively hunting and killing the predators that had brought the railway project to the brink of collapse. His experience as a hunter in India had taught him that man-eating carnivores, once they had developed a taste for human flesh, would continue their predations until they were either killed or driven away by sustained pressure. The defensive measures he had implemented could only postpone the inevitable next attack. They could not eliminate the threat entirely. The lieutenant colonel began his hunting campaign by conducting a systematic study of the behavior patterns exhibited by the 2 lions during their previous attacks. The evidence suggested that the predators were following a deliberate strategy that minimized their own risk while maximizing their chances of success. Both attacks had occurred during the darkest hours of the night, when visibility was at its worst and the guards were most likely to be affected by fatigue. The lions had approached the camps from different directions on each occasion, suggesting that they possessed detailed knowledge of the layout and security arrangements. Most significantly, the predators had demonstrated an apparent ability to identify and target isolated victims with remarkable precision. Both Ungan Singh and Pathania had been sleeping alone in their tents at the time of their seizure, despite Patterson's earlier recommendations that the workers share accommodations. This suggested that the lions possessed not only extraordinary hunting skills, but also a level of intelligence that allowed them to assess and exploit human vulnerabilities with almost supernatural effectiveness. Patterson's first hunting strategy involved the construction of a mashan, an elevated platform that would allow him to observe and shoot at the lions from a position of relative safety. The lieutenant colonel selected a site approximately 200 yards from the main worker camps, positioned to provide clear fields of fire while remaining close enough to the construction site to intercept any predators approaching from the most likely directions. The mashan was constructed from locally available materials under Patterson's direct supervision, with particular attention paid to ensuring that the structure would remain silent during use and provide adequate concealment for a waiting hunter. The platform stood 12 feet above the ground, supported by a framework of sturdy poles that had been firmly anchored in the hard earth. The hunting blind was camouflaged with local vegetation and equipped with comfortable seating that would allow Patterson to maintain his vigil for extended periods without fatigue. Most importantly, the Machine was positioned to take advantage of the prevailing wind patterns, ensuring that the hunter's scent would not be carried toward any approaching predators. Patterson equipped himself with his most reliable hunting rifle, a 3033 Lee Enfield, that he had used successfully against dangerous game in India. The weapon was fitted with a powerful telescopic sight and loaded with soft-point bullets designed to deliver maximum stopping power against large carnivores. The lieutenant colonel also carried a backup rifle and an adequate supply of ammunition, understanding that a wounded lion represented an even greater threat than an unwounded one. The first night of Patterson's hunting vigil began at sunset on April 16th. With the lieutenant colonel taking his position on the Machine as the last light faded from the western sky. The evening air was still and heavy, carrying the myriad sounds of the African night as the diurnal creatures gave way to their nocturnal counterparts. The distant calls of hyenas echoed across the plains, while the closer sounds of insects and small mammals created a constant backdrop of natural activity. As the hours of darkness stretched on, Patterson maintained his vigil with the patient intensity that marked the experienced hunter. His senses remained alert to every sound and movement in the surrounding bush, his rifle ready for instant use should the opportunity for a shot present itself. The lieutenant colonel understood that successful hunting of man-eating lions required not only marksmanship skills, but also the psychological fortitude to remain motionless and alert for hours at a time under conditions of extreme tension and discomfort. The night passed without incident, though Patterson remained on the Machine until the first light of dawn revealed the empty landscape around the construction camps. The absence of any lion activity during his first night of hunting was not unexpected, as the lieutenant colonel understood that the predators might require time to adjust to the changed circumstances represented by his active hunting campaign. However, the knowledge that the lions remained at large somewhere in the surrounding wilderness meant that the threat to his workers continued unabated. Patterson's second night on the Machine, April 17th, began with the same careful preparation and patient vigilance that had characterized his first hunting effort. The lieutenant colonel had spent the daylight hours studying the tracks and sign left by the lions during their previous attacks, hoping to identify patterns that might allow him to predict their future behavior. The evidence suggested that the predators preferred to approach the camps from the downstream side of the river, where the dense vegetation provided optimal concealment for their stalking approach. As midnight approached, Patterson detected subtle changes in the ambient sounds of the African night that suggested the presence of something large moving through the bush in the direction of the construction camps. The normal chorus of insects and small mammals began to fade in a wave that seemed to follow the movement of some unseen presence through the thorny vegetation. The lieutenant colonel gripped his rifle more tightly and strained his eyes in an attempt to penetrate the darkness that concealed whatever was approaching the camps. The tension continued to build for what seemed like hours, but was probably no more than 30 or 40 minutes before Patterson caught his first glimpse of one of the man-eating lions. The massive predator emerged from the concealing vegetation like a ghost materializing from the darkness, its enormous form moving with a silence and grace that seemed impossible for an animal of such size. The lion paused at the edge of the cleared area around the camps, its head raised as it tested the night air for any scent that might indicate danger or opportunity. Patterson could scarcely believe the size of the animal that stood before him at a distance of approximately 150 yards. The lion was larger than any he had encountered during his hunting experiences in India, with a massive head and powerful shoulders that spoke to incredible physical strength. Most remarkably, the predator appeared to be completely maneless, a characteristic that was virtually unknown among the lions of East Africa, and gave the animal an almost alien appearance that was deeply unsettling even to an experienced hunter. The lieutenant colonel slowly brought his rifle to his shoulder, taking care to avoid any sudden movements that might alert the lion to his presence on the Machine. The telescopic sight provided an adequate view of the target despite the darkness, and Patterson was confident that he could place an accurate shot at the range involved. The hunter took careful aim at the lion's shoulder, targeting the vital area that would provide the best chance of a quick, clean kill that would prevent the wounded animal from escaping into the bush. Just as Patterson was about to squeeze the trigger, the lion suddenly turned and melted back into the vegetation with the same supernatural silence that had marked its arrival. The predator seemed to simply vanish into the darkness, leaving the frustrated hunter wondering whether he had actually seen the animal or had been the victim of some elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion and nervous tension. The sudden disappearance of such a massive creature without any apparent cause left Patterson with an uncomfortable sense that he was dealing with adversaries that possessed capabilities beyond those of normal lions. The remainder of the night passed without further incident, though Patterson remained alert to the possibility that the lion might return or that its companion might attempt an approach from a different direction. The lieutenant colonel's confidence in his hunting strategy had been somewhat shaken by the evening's events, as the ease with which the lion had approached and withdrawn suggested that the predators possessed an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings that would make them extremely difficult to hunt successfully. As dawn broke over the Tsavo construction site, Patterson climbed down from his machine with mixed feelings about the night's hunting effort. On the positive side, he had confirmed that at least one of the man-eating lions was still in the immediate vicinity of the construction camps, and he had gained valuable intelligence about the size and appearance of his quarry. However, the apparent ease with which the lion had detected and avoided the threat represented by the hidden hunter suggested that eliminating these predators would require strategies and tactics beyond those that had proven successful against normal lions. The lieutenant colonel spent the morning hours discussing the previous night's events with his subordinate officers and experienced hunters among the construction crew. The consensus among the group was that the man-eating lions possessed sensory capabilities and intelligence levels that exceeded those of typical members of their species. This assessment was supported not only by Patterson's observations, but also by the testimony of local tribal members who spoke of these particular lions as supernatural beings that possessed powers beyond those of normal animals. The lieutenant colonel found himself facing adversaries that seemed to anticipate and counter his strategies almost before he could implement them. Predators that combined the physical capabilities of apex carnivores with an intelligence and cunning that bordered on the supernatural. The stage was set for an escalating contest of wits and skills between human determination and animal cunning that would test every aspect of Patterson's experience and ingenuity. The man-eating lions had demonstrated that they were not merely larger and more aggressive versions of normal lions, but something altogether different and more dangerous. The lieutenant colonel understood that his next hunting attempts would need to incorporate this new understanding of his quarry's capabilities if he hoped to protect his workers and save the railway construction project from complete collapse. The false sense of security that had begun to develop during Patterson's first hunting efforts was brutally shattered on the night of April 20th, when the man-eating lions demonstrated their ability to strike despite the enhanced security measures that had been implemented throughout the construction camps. The attack occurred with such speed and stealth that it seemed to materialize from the very air itself, leaving no doubt that the predators possessed capabilities that transcended normal animal behavior and approached the realm of the supernatural. Patterson had spent the early evening hours of April 20th conducting his usual inspection of the defensive arrangements, checking on the positioning of guards, and ensuring that all workers were following the established protocols for nighttime security. The lieutenant colonel had particular cause for optimism that evening, as 3 consecutive nights had passed without incident since his hunting vigil had begun. The enhanced lighting throughout the camps created an atmosphere of relative normalcy, and many of the Indian coolies had begun to display the first signs of returning confidence in their safety. The attack began at approximately 11:30 in the evening, when the night shift guards reported hearing unusual sounds emanating from the section of the camp where the plate-laying gangs were housed. These sounds were initially dismissed as normal nocturnal animal activity, as the African wilderness was never truly quiet during the hours of darkness. However, the experienced guards soon recognized that the sounds were moving in a deliberate pattern that suggested the presence of something large and predatory approaching the sleeping workers. Before any effective response could be organized, the sounds were replaced by the terrified screams of a human victim that echoed across the construction site with a clarity and intensity that left no doubt about what was occurring. The screams continued for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably no more than 15 or 20 seconds before being abruptly cut off in a manner that suggested the worst possible outcome. The sudden silence that followed was more ominous than the screams themselves, as it indicated that whatever had seized the victim was now retreating into the safety of the surrounding wilderness. Patterson emerged from his tent within moments of hearing the first screams, his rifle in hand, and his mind instantly focused on the crisis that was unfolding. The lieutenant colonel could see guards converging on the affected area from all directions, their lanterns creating dancing pools of light that illuminated the confusion and terror that had suddenly descended upon the camps. The victim's tent stood silent and motionless in the flickering light, its canvas walls showing the all too familiar signs of violent intrusion that had marked the previous attacks. The scene that greeted Patterson and the first responders was a horrifying repetition of the attacks that had claimed Ungan Singh and Pathania. The tent had been torn open by massive claws, and the interior showed clear evidence of a violent struggle that had ended with the victim being dragged away into the darkness. The victim in this case was identified as Kalu, experienced coolie who had been among the most vocal advocates for continuing the railway construction despite the obvious dangers posed by the man-eating lions. What made this attack particularly disturbing was the evidence that it had been carried out despite the presence of multiple guards in the immediate vicinity and the enhanced lighting that had been installed throughout the camps. The predator, or predators responsible, had apparently approached the victim's tent, seized their prey, and retreated into the bush without being detected by any of the security measures that Patterson had so carefully implemented. This demonstration of stealth and cunning left the lieutenant colonel with the uncomfortable realization that his defensive strategies had proven inadequate against adversaries of such extraordinary capability. The trail leading away from Kalu's tent was even more clearly marked than those that had followed the previous attacks, suggesting that the lions were becoming increasingly bold and confident in their operations against the construction camps. The massive paw prints in the soft earth told the story of two large predators working in coordination, with one animal apparently serving as a distraction while the other carried out the actual seizure of the victim. This level of tactical sophistication was unprecedented in Patterson's experience with dangerous game, and suggested that the man-eating lions possessed intelligence and planning capabilities that exceeded those of normal carnivores. Patterson organized an immediate pursuit along the trail left by the attackers, though he harbored little hope of overtaking predators that had demonstrated such superior knowledge of the local terrain. The lieutenant colonel led a heavily armed party of guards and volunteers through the thorny vegetation that surrounded the construction site, their way illuminated by powerful lanterns that cast eerie shadows among the twisted branches of the acacia trees. The urgency of their mission was underscored by the remote possibility that Kalu might still be alive and in need of rescue, though the pattern of previous attacks suggested that such hope was probably futile. The pursuit led the rescue party through increasingly difficult terrain, as the predators had once again made directly for the thickest cover available in the vicinity. The thorny undergrowth seemed to close around the pursuers like a living entity, tearing at their clothing and skin while concealing potential dangers in every shadow. The blood trail remained visible in the beam of the lanterns, providing a clear indication of the route taken by the attackers and their victim as they moved away from the construction camps toward their intended feeding ground. After following the trail for nearly a mile through the densest bush in the area, the searchers discovered the remains of Kalu in a small clearing that had obviously been used by the lions for their previous feeding activities. The scene was one of such horror and brutality that even the most experienced members of the search party were overcome with revulsion and had to withdraw from the immediate area. The evidence suggested that the victim had endured a prolonged ordeal before finally succumbing to his injuries, and the thorough nature of the consumption indicated that the predators had fed with complete confidence in their security from human interference. The discovery of Kalu's remains had an immediate and devastating impact on the morale of the construction workforce that exceeded even the effects of the previous attacks. The realization that the enhanced security measures had proven inadequate against the man-eating lions created a sense of helplessness and despair that threatened to completely destroy the cohesion of the construction crews. Many of the Indian coolies began to speak openly at the lions as supernatural beings that possessed powers beyond the ability of human weapons to defeat, while others demanded immediate evacuation from what they now viewed as a cursed and haunted land. Patterson found himself facing the most serious crisis of his military career as the psychological foundation of the railway construction project began to crumble under the weight of terror and superstition. The lieutenant colonel understood that another attack of similar nature would almost certainly result in the complete collapse of the workforce and the abandonment of the bridge construction that represented the key to the entire railway project. The stakes could not have been higher, as failure at Tsavo would represent not only a personal defeat, but a significant setback to British imperial ambitions in East Africa. The lieutenant colonel spent the remainder of the night and the following morning in urgent consultations with his subordinate officers and senior staff, searching for strategies that might prove more effective against adversaries that had demonstrated such extraordinary capabilities. The consensus among the group was that conventional hunting techniques would prove inadequate against predators that possessed such superior knowledge of the terrain and such apparent ability to detect and avoid human threats. New approaches would be required that took into account the almost supernatural cunning and intelligence that the man-eating lions had displayed. Patterson's immediate response to the crisis involved the implementation of even more stringent security measures, including the construction of additional barriers around the worker camps and the establishment of roving patrols that would maintain constant movement throughout the night hours. However, the lieutenant colonel was acutely aware that such defensive measures could only postpone the next attack rather than eliminate the underlying threat. The man-eating lions had demonstrated their ability to penetrate the most carefully planned defenses, and there was no reason to believe that additional barriers would prove more effective than those that had already failed. More fundamentally, Patterson recognized that his hunting strategy would need to be completely reconsidered in light of the superior capabilities that the predators had displayed. The conventional approach of waiting in ambush for the lions to approach had proven inadequate against animals that possessed such extraordinary sensory abilities and tactical intelligence. New methods would be required that could match the cunning and adaptability of adversaries that seemed to anticipate and counter every human stratagem almost before it could be implemented. The attacks on Ungan Singh, Pathania, and Kalu had established a pattern that left no doubt about the intentions and capabilities of the man-eating lions. The predators were not merely opportunistic hunters taking advantage of an available food source. They were deliberate and intelligent adversaries that had chosen to wage war against the railway construction project and everything it represented. The lieutenant colonel understood that the next phase of this deadly contest would require him to abandon conventional approaches and develop entirely new strategies that could match the extraordinary cunning of the most formidable predators he had ever encountered. The stage was set for an escalating confrontation that would test every aspect of Patterson's military training, hunting experience, and personal courage. The man-eating lions of Tsavo had established their dominance over the construction camps through 3 successful attacks that had demonstrated capabilities far beyond those of normal carnivores. The lieutenant colonel found himself facing adversaries that combined the physical power of apex predators with intelligence and cunning that seemed to border on the supernatural. predators that had chosen to challenge the advance of human civilization through one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth. The morning following the death of Kalu dawned gray and overcast, as if the African sky itself reflected the pall of despair that had settled over the Tsavo construction camps. Patterson stood at the center of the main camp, surrounded by clusters of terrified Indian coolies, whose frightened voices created a constant murmur of anxiety and superstition that seemed to hang in the still air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The lieutenant colonel understood that he was witnessing the beginning of the complete psychological collapse of his workforce, a dissolution that would prove far more devastating to the railway project than any physical obstacle they had previously encountered. The immediate aftermath of the third attack revealed the full extent of the crisis that now confronted the railway construction effort. Nearly a quarter of the Indian coolies had simply disappeared during the night, abandoning their contracts and possessions in a desperate flight from what they had come to regard as a cursed and demon-haunted wilderness. Those workers who remained displayed a level of terror and demoralization that rendered them virtually incapable of productive labor as they huddled together in groups and cast constant fearful glances toward the surrounding bush. Patterson's subordinate officers reported that normal construction activities had ground to a virtual halt, as the workers refused to undertake any assignments that required them to move beyond the immediate vicinity of the main camp. The plate-laying gangs declined to advance the railroad tracks beyond the areas that were in clear sight of the defensive positions, while the bridge construction crews abandoned their work sites whenever clouds passed over the sun and created shadows that might conceal approaching predators. The carefully orchestrated symphony of industrial progress that had characterized the project since Patterson's arrival had been replaced by the chaotic discord of a workforce paralyzed by terror. The lieutenant colonel convened an emergency meeting of all his officers and senior staff to address the deteriorating situation and develop strategies for salvaging the railway project from complete collapse. The gathering took place in Patterson's headquarters tent, where the assembled men grappled with challenges that exceeded anything in their previous experience. The consensus among the group was that they were facing an unprecedented situation that required extraordinary measures if the construction effort was to continue. Patterson's first priority involved the implementation of even more comprehensive defensive measures designed to create an impregnable fortress around the remaining workers. The lieutenant colonel ordered the construction of a continuous barrier of thorn bushes and other obstacles around the entire perimeter of the consolidated camps, creating a defensive line that would channel any approaching predators into predetermined killing zones where they could be engaged by concentrated firepower. This barrier was reinforced with tripwires and alarm systems that would provide early warning of any attempted intrusion. The internal organization of the camps was completely reorganized to maximize security while maintaining the minimum level of functionality necessary for continued construction work. All workers were relocated to large communal tents that housed 20 or more men each, ensuring that no individual would ever be alone and vulnerable during the dangerous night hours. These communal shelters were positioned at the center of the defensive perimeter and surrounded by multiple rings of guards and obstacles that would make any predator attack extremely difficult to carry out successfully. Patterson established a system of roving patrols that maintained constant movement throughout the night hours, ensuring that no section of the defensive perimeter would remain unobserved for more than a few minutes at a time. These patrols were equipped with powerful rifles and lanterns, and they followed predetermined routes that provided overlapping coverage of all approaches to the worker camps. The patrol system was designed to prevent the man-eating lions from conducting the detailed reconnaissance that had apparently preceded their previous attacks. Most significantly, Patterson instituted a regime of continuous illumination that transformed the construction camps into a blaze of light during the hours of darkness. Additional lanterns and torches were positioned throughout the defensive perimeter, creating an artificial daylight that would eliminate the cover of darkness that the predators had used so effectively in their previous attacks. The lieutenant colonel understood that the lions had demonstrated a marked preference for operating under conditions of complete darkness, and he hoped that constant illumination might discourage them from attempting further attacks. Despite these comprehensive defensive measures, Patterson recognized that fortress tactics could only postpone the next attack rather than eliminate the underlying threat posed by the man-eating lions. The predators had already demonstrated their ability to penetrate carefully planned defenses, and their apparent intelligence suggested that they would eventually develop strategies to overcome even the most elaborate obstacles. More fundamentally, the conversion of the construction camps into a besieged fortress made normal railway construction work virtually impossible and threatened to delay the project indefinitely. The lieutenant colonel's hunting strategy underwent a complete revision in light of the superior capabilities that the lions had displayed during their previous attacks. Patterson abandoned his earlier approach of waiting in ambush for the predators to approach the construction camps, recognizing that such passive tactics were inadequate against adversaries that possessed such extraordinary sensory abilities and tactical intelligence. Instead, he began to develop more aggressive hunting methods that would carry the fight to the lions rather than waiting for them to choose the time and place of the next encounter. Patterson's new hunting approach involved the systematic exploration and mapping of the territory surrounding the construction camps, with particular attention to identifying the lions' preferred feeding grounds and travel routes. The lieutenant colonel organized small parties of experienced hunters and local guides who conducted careful reconnaissance missions during the daylight hours, when the lions were presumably resting in the dense vegetation that provided concealment from the African sun. These reconnaissance efforts were designed to gather intelligence about the predators' behavior patterns and identify locations where they might be vulnerable to attack. The mapping expeditions revealed that the man-eating lions had established a territory that encompassed several square miles of thorny wilderness surrounding the construction site. The predators appeared to maintain multiple feeding grounds in secluded clearings scattered throughout the densest bush, and they had created an extensive network of game trails that allowed them to move rapidly and silently between these various locations. Most significantly, the reconnaissance teams discovered evidence of a large cave system in the rocky hills several miles from the construction camps, caves that appeared to serve as the lions' primary den and resting place during the daylight hours. Patterson's intelligence-gathering efforts also revealed disturbing evidence about the true nature and capabilities of the man-eating lions. Local tribal members who were questioned about the predators spoke of them as supernatural beings that had terrorized the region for years before the arrival of the railway construction crews. According to these accounts, the lions were responsible for hundreds of deaths among the local population, and they possessed powers that exceeded those of normal animals. The tribal members described the predators as ghosts or demons that could appear and disappear at will, creatures that were invulnerable to conventional weapons and could only be defeated through magical means. While Patterson dismissed the supernatural aspects of these accounts as primitive superstition, he could not ignore the factual elements that corroborated his own observations about the lion's extraordinary size and intelligence. The tribal testimony confirmed that the predators were indeed maneless males of exceptional proportions, and that they had developed hunting techniques that differed significantly from those employed by normal lions. Most importantly, the local accounts suggested that the man-eating behavior was not a recent development, but had been established for years before the arrival of the railway construction project. The lieutenant colonel's analysis of the available evidence led him to conclude that he was facing adversaries that represented an extreme evolutionary adaptation to the specific environmental conditions of the Tsavo region. The maneless appearance of the lions was apparently a response to the thorny vegetation that characterized their territory, as a heavy mane would have been a significant disadvantage when moving through dense bush. Their extraordinary size and strength had developed as adaptations for taking large prey in a region where traditional lion hunting methods were less effective due to the scattered nature of the available game animals. Most significantly, Patterson recognized that the lion's apparent intelligence and tactical sophistication represented learned behaviors that had been refined through years of successful hunting in an environment that demanded superior cunning and adaptability. The predators had apparently learned to view humans as preferred prey items, developing specialized techniques for hunting people that took advantage of human behavioral patterns and vulnerabilities. This learning process had created adversaries that combined the physical capabilities of apex predators with strategic thinking abilities that approached those of human military commanders. As the fourth night since Kalu's death approached, Patterson's fortress-like defensive arrangements were put to their first test. The lieutenant colonel took personal command of the defensive preparations, positioning himself at the center of the camps where he could coordinate the response to any attack that might develop. The enhanced lighting transformed the construction site into an island of artificial daylight, surrounded by the impenetrable darkness of the African wilderness, while the continuous patrols maintained vigilant watch for any sign of approaching predators. The night passed without incident, though the absence of an attack was more ominous than reassuring given the pattern that had been established by the man-eating lions. Patterson understood that the predators were probably observing the new defensive arrangements and developing strategies to overcome them, a process that might require several nights of reconnaissance before they were ready to attempt another attack. The lieutenant colonel used this respite to refine his own plans and prepare for the inevitable test of his defensive measures. The psychological impact of the siege mentality on the remaining workers continued to intensify despite the absence of immediate attacks. The Indian coolies existed in a state of constant terror that made normal conversation and activity virtually impossible, while the isolation and confinement of the fortress-like camps created additional stresses that threatened to drive many of the men to complete psychological breakdown. Patterson recognized that his defensive strategy, while temporarily effective, could not be sustained indefinitely without completely destroying the morale and effectiveness of his workforce. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation between human determination and animal cunning that would determine the ultimate fate of the railway construction project. Patterson's fortress tactics had succeeded in protecting his workers from immediate attack, but they had also transformed the construction camps into a prison that threatened to destroy the project through psychological attrition. The lieutenant colonel understood that his next moves would need to break the deadlock that had developed and carry the fight to the man-eating lions before the siege mentality completely destroyed his ability to continue the railway construction work. The oppressive siege mentality that had gripped the Tsavo construction camps for nearly a week was shattered on the evening of April 28th by an attack that demonstrated the man-eating lion's ability to overcome even the most carefully planned defensive measures. The assault came not from the expected direction across the cleared ground surrounding the camps, but from beneath the earth itself, as one of the predators exploited a vulnerability that Patterson and his men had never imagined could exist. The attack began at approximately midnight when the night shift guards reported hearing strange scratching and digging sounds emanating from the area beneath one of the large communal tents that housed the plate-laying crew. These sounds were initially dismissed as the activity of small nocturnal animals, as the sandy soil of the construction site was home to numerous burrowing creatures that emerged to forage during the hours of darkness. However, the experienced guards soon recognized that the sounds were too regular and purposeful to represent normal animal behavior. Before any effective investigation could be conducted, the sounds were replaced by screams of terror that seemed to emerge from the very earth itself. The source of these screams was immediately identified as coming from within one of the communal tents, though the nature of the disturbance was unlike anything that had occurred during the previous attacks. The screams continued for nearly a full minute before being joined by the confused shouts of other workers who were awakening to find themselves in the midst of an incomprehensible nightmare. Patterson emerged from his headquarters at the first sound of disturbance, his rifle in hand and his mind struggling to comprehend the nature of the crisis that was unfolding. The lieutenant colonel could see that the guards were converging on the affected tent from all directions, but their response was hampered by confusion about the source and nature of the threat they were facing. The tent itself appeared normal from the outside, with no signs of the external damage that had characterized the previous attacks. The scene that greeted Patterson and the first responders inside the communal tent was one of chaos and terror that exceeded even the horror of the earlier attacks. The sandy floor of the tent had been excavated from beneath, creating a tunnel that led directly into the sleeping area where 20 Indian coolies had been resting. One of the workers, a man named Gunga Ram, had been seized through this tunnel and was in the process of being dragged underground when the other occupants of the tent awakened to the nightmare that was unfolding in their midst. The sight of their comrade disappearing into what appeared to be the very earth itself had a devastating psychological impact on the remaining workers that exceeded even their reactions to the previous attacks. Several of the men collapsed in shock, while others began to scream about demons and evil spirits that could emerge from the ground without warning. The carefully maintained discipline of the construction crews disintegrated completely as word of the underground attack spread throughout the camps with the speed of wildfire. Patterson immediately organized a rescue attempt, though he understood that the chances of saving Gunga Ram were virtually non-existent, given the nature of the seizure and the time that had already elapsed. The lieutenant colonel led a party of volunteers in an attempt to follow the tunnel that had been excavated beneath the tent. But the narrow diameter and unstable construction of the passage made human pursuit extremely dangerous and ultimately impossible. The tunnel appeared to extend for a considerable distance before connecting with what was apparently a larger burrow system that had been constructed over an extended period of time. The predators had apparently spent weeks, or possibly months, excavating an elaborate network of underground passages that allowed them to approach the construction camps without being detected by any of the surface defenses. This underground approach had enabled them to bypass all of the barriers, guards, and alarm systems that Patterson had so carefully established around the perimeter of the camps. The engineering sophistication of the tunnel system suggested a level of intelligence and planning capability that transcended normal animal behavior and approached the realm of military engineering. The main tunnel had been carefully excavated to avoid the various obstacles and foundations that might have impeded its progress, while secondary passages provided alternative routes and escape options that demonstrated strategic thinking of a high order. Most disturbing of all, the tunnel system appeared to have multiple entry points beneath different sections of the construction camps, suggesting that the Lions had conducted detailed reconnaissance of the entire facility before beginning their excavation work. Patterson's investigation of the tunnel system revealed that the predators had been conducting their underground reconnaissance for much longer than anyone had suspected. The main passage showed signs of recent enlargement and improvement, but the basic excavation appeared to have been in progress for weeks before the first attack on Ungan Singh. This timeline suggested that the man-eating lions had been planning their assault on the construction camps from the very beginning of Patterson's tenure, developing a comprehensive strategy that took into account every aspect of the human defenses and identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited through patient and methodical preparation. The psychological impact of the underground attack on the remaining workforce was immediate and catastrophic. The Indian coolies had managed to maintain some semblance of composure during the previous attacks, which could at least be understood as the work of extraordinarily large and cunning predators operating according to recognizable animal behavior patterns. The idea that the lions possessed the intelligence and capability to construct elaborate tunnel systems struck at fundamental assumptions about the nature of the threat they were facing. Many of the workers began to speak openly of supernatural forces and demonic possession, their fears inflamed by the apparent impossibility of defending against predators that could emerge from the very ground beneath their feet. The carefully constructed barriers and defensive positions that had provided some psychological comfort to the men were suddenly revealed as completely inadequate against enemies that possessed the ability to bypass surface defenses entirely. The fortress mentality that had characterized the camps since Kalu's death was replaced by a sense of complete helplessness and despair. Patterson found himself facing the most serious crisis of his entire career as the foundation of the railway construction project crumbled beneath the weight of terror and superstition. The lieutenant colonel understood that the underground attack had crossed a psychological threshold that would make it virtually impossible to maintain any semblance of normal construction activities. The remaining workers were now convinced that they were facing supernatural adversaries that possessed powers beyond the ability of human weapons and defenses to counter. The immediate response to the crisis involved a complete evacuation of the communal tents and a frantic search for alternative accommodations that might provide some protection against underground attack. However, Patterson quickly realized that no defensive measures could provide absolute security against predators that possessed the ability to tunnel beneath any fortification. The underground capability of the man-eating lions had effectively neutralized every defensive strategy that conventional military thinking could devise. More fundamentally, the lieutenant colonel recognized that his approach to the crisis had been completely inadequate from the beginning. The discovery of the tunnel system revealed that he was actually confronting adversaries that possessed intelligence and planning capabilities that approached those of human military commanders. Patterson's hunting strategy underwent another complete revision as he grappled with the implications of the underground attack. The lieutenant colonel understood that conventional hunting techniques would prove completely inadequate against predators that possessed such superior knowledge of the terrain and such extraordinary engineering capabilities. New approaches would be required that took into account the almost supernatural intelligence and adaptability that the man-eating lions had demonstrated. The lieutenant colonel spent the remainder of the night and the following morning in urgent consultations with his subordinate officers, local guides, and anyone else who might possess useful knowledge about the behavior and capabilities of the Tsavo lions. The consensus among the group was that they were facing a completely unprecedented situation that required extraordinary measures if the railway construction project was to survive. Conventional military and hunting techniques had proven inadequate against adversaries that combined the physical capabilities of apex predators with intelligence and engineering skills that exceeded those of many human military units. The man-eating lions had demonstrated capabilities that transcended every assumption about animal behavior and intelligence, revealing themselves as adversaries that possessed strategic thinking abilities and engineering skills that approached the supernatural. The lieutenant colonel understood that his next moves would determine not only the fate of the railway project, but also his own survival and that of every man under his command in this increasingly desperate struggle against the most formidable predators he had ever encountered. The discovery of the tunnel system marked a turning point in Patterson's campaign against the man-eating lions, forcing the lieutenant colonel to abandon his defensive strategy and adopt a more aggressive approach that would carry the fight directly to the predators in their own territory. The psychological impact of the underground attack had made it clear that no defensive measures could provide adequate protection against adversaries that possessed such extraordinary intelligence and engineering capabilities. Patterson understood that the only viable solution lay in hunting down and killing the lions before they could launch another assault that would complete the destruction of the railway construction project. Patterson's new hunting strategy was based on intelligence gathered during the reconnaissance expeditions that had mapped the lions' territory in the weeks following Kalu's death. The lieutenant colonel had identified several locations where the predators were most likely to be found during the daylight hours, including the cave system in the Rocky Hills several miles from the construction camps. However, Patterson also recognized that approaching these strongholds during daylight would be extremely dangerous, as the lions would have every advantage of terrain and concealment in their familiar territory. Instead, the lieutenant colonel decided to attempt an ambush at one of the feeding grounds that the predators used after their successful hunts. The reconnaissance teams had identified a secluded clearing, approximately 1 mile from the construction camps, where the lions had apparently consumed their previous victims. This location offered several advantages for a hunting ambush, including multiple escape routes for the hunter and clear fields of fire that would maximize the chances of a successful shot. Patterson's preparations for the ambush were more elaborate than any he had previously undertaken, reflecting his growing understanding of the extraordinary capabilities possessed by his quarry. The lieutenant colonel selected his most powerful rifle, a .33 Lee Enfield loaded with soft-point bullets designed to deliver maximum stopping power against large carnivores. He also carried a backup weapon and an adequate supply of ammunition, understanding that wounded lions represented an even greater threat than unwounded ones. The ambush site was carefully prepared to provide optimal concealment and shooting positions while minimizing the hunter's scent signature that might alert the approaching predators. Patterson constructed a small blind from local vegetation that would provide concealment without restricting his ability to bring his rifle to bear quickly and accurately. The position was selected to take advantage of the prevailing wind patterns, ensuring that the hunter's scent would be carried away from the most likely approach routes used by the lions. Most importantly, Patterson's ambush strategy incorporated multiple contingency plans that would allow him to respond effectively to the various scenarios that might develop during the hunt. The lieutenant colonel had studied the feeding behavior of the lions based on the evidence found at their previous kill sites, and he had identified the most likely times and directions from which they might approach the clearing. However, he also understood that the predator's extraordinary intelligence made it essential to prepare for unexpected developments that might require rapid adaptation of his hunting tactics. The evening air was still and heavy, carrying the familiar sounds of the African night as the diurnal creatures gave way to their nocturnal counterparts. Patterson settled into his concealed position with the patient determination that marked the experienced hunter, his senses alert to every sound and movement in the surrounding wilderness. As the hours of darkness stretched on, Patterson maintained his vigil with an intensity born of desperate necessity. The lieutenant colonel understood that the survival of the railway project and the lives of his remaining workers depended on the success of his hunting efforts. The man-eating lions had demonstrated their ability to overcome every defensive measure that conventional military thinking could devise, leaving offensive action as the only viable option for breaking the deadlock that threatened to destroy the construction effort entirely. The night air carried the distant sounds of hyenas and other scavengers, their calls echoing across the thorny wilderness as they went about their nocturnal foraging activities. Patterson remained motionless in his blind, his rifle ready for instant use should the opportunity for a shot present itself. The lieutenant colonel's military training had taught him the importance of patience and discipline during extended periods of tension and uncertainty, qualities that would prove essential during the long hours of the hunting vigil. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, Patterson detected subtle changes in the ambient sounds of the African night that suggested the presence of something large moving through the bush in the direction of the feeding ground. The normal chorus of insects and small mammals began to fade in a wave that seemed to follow the movement of some unseen presence through the thorny vegetation. The lieutenant colonel gripped his rifle more tightly and strained his eyes in an attempt to penetrate the darkness that concealed whatever was approaching the clearing. The tension continued to build for what seemed like hours, but was probably no more than 20 minutes before Patterson caught his first glimpse of one of the man-eating lions. The massive predator emerged from the concealing vegetation with the same supernatural silence that had characterized its previous appearances, its enormous form moving through the darkness like a living shadow. The lion paused at the edge of the clearing, its massive head raised as it tested the night air for any scent that might indicate danger or opportunity. Patterson could scarcely believe that he was finally face to face with one of the creatures that had terrorized his construction camps for weeks. The lion was even larger than he had estimated based on the tracks and other evidence, with a massive head and powerful shoulders that spoke to incredible physical strength. The predator's maneless appearance gave it an alien and sinister aspect that was deeply unsettling even to an experienced hunter, as if Patterson was confronting some primordial force that predated human civilization. The lieutenant colonel slowly brought his rifle to his shoulder, taking care to avoid any sudden movements that might alert the lion to his presence in the concealed blind. The distance to the target was approximately 75 yards, well within the effective range of his weapon under ideal conditions. However, the darkness and the lion's position at the edge of the clearing made precise shot placement extremely challenging, requiring Patterson to rely on his extensive experience with dangerous game hunting. The lion remained motionless for several minutes, apparently conducting a careful reconnaissance of the clearing before committing itself to entering the open ground where it would be vulnerable to attack. Patterson used this time to steady his aim and control his breathing in preparation for the shot that would determine the outcome of his hunting campaign. The lieutenant colonel understood that he would probably have only one opportunity to kill the predator before it either escaped into the bush or turned to attack its would-be hunter. As Patterson prepared to squeeze the trigger, the lion suddenly turned its massive head in his direction, its eyes seeming to look directly into the blind where the hunter lay concealed. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and hunter regarded each other across the small clearing, each taking the measure of an adversary that represented mortal danger. The lion's intelligence was clearly visible in its eyes, which displayed a level of awareness and calculation that exceeded anything Patterson had encountered in his previous hunting experiences. The standoff lasted for perhaps 10 seconds before the lion apparently satisfied itself that no immediate threat was present and began to move into the clearing with the confident stride of an apex predator that feared nothing in its domain. The opportunity came when the lion paused in the center of the clearing, its massive form silhouetted against the slightly lighter background of the night sky. Patterson carefully aimed at the animal's shoulder, targeting the vital area that would provide the best chance of penetrating to the heart and lungs, while avoiding the heavy bone structure that might deflect a poorly placed bullet. The explosion of the gunshot shattered the silence of the African night like a thunderclap, the muzzle flash illuminating the clearing in a brief but brilliant flash of light. Patterson's shot struck the lion exactly where he had aimed, penetrating the shoulder and causing the massive predator to stagger under the impact of the heavy bullet. However, instead of falling immediately, the wounded lion let out a roar of rage and pain that seemed to shake the very earth beneath Patterson's feet. The wounded lion spun toward the source of the shot with incredible speed, its massive form covering the distance to Patterson's blind in great bounding leaps that demonstrated the tremendous power and agility that had made it such a formidable predator. The lieutenant colonel barely had time to work the bolt of his rifle and chamber a second round before the enraged animal was upon him, its massive claws and teeth seeking to destroy the enemy that had dared to challenge its dominance. Patterson's second shot was fired at point-blank range as the lion crashed through the vegetation that concealed his blind, the muzzle of his rifle almost touching the predator's massive head when he pulled the trigger. This shot struck the lion in the brain, killing it instantly and causing the enormous animal to collapse in a heap just inches from where the lieutenant colonel lay sprawled among the wreckage of his concealment. The sudden silence that followed the death of the first man-eating lion was almost as shocking as the violence that had preceded it. Patterson lay motionless for several minutes, his ears ringing from the gunshots and his mind struggling to comprehend that he had actually succeeded in killing one of the most formidable predators he had ever encountered. The massive carcass of the lion lay so close to his position that he could have reached out and touched it, a testament to how narrow his margin of survival had been during the final moments of the encounter. As the shock of the confrontation began to fade, Patterson carefully extracted himself from the remains of his blind and conducted a thorough examination of his kill. The lion was even more impressive in death than it had been in life, measuring over 9 feet from nose to tail and weighing what the lieutenant colonel estimated to be close to 400 pounds. The predator's massive head and powerful limbs testified to the incredible strength that had made it capable of seizing and carrying away full-grown men with apparent ease. Its hide bore the scars of old bullet wounds, and one of its canine teeth had been broken off at some point during its violent career. These battle scars suggested that Patterson had been facing an adversary that had learned from previous conflicts with humans and had developed the cunning and wariness that had made it so difficult to hunt successfully. Patterson's examination of the dead lion also revealed physical adaptations that explained some of the extraordinary capabilities that the predator had displayed. The animal's paws were unusually large and equipped with exceptionally sharp claws that would have been ideal for the excavation work involved in constructing the tunnel system. Its muscle development was extraordinary even for a lion, particularly in the shoulders and hindquarters, that provided the power necessary for dragging heavy prey over considerable distances. The lieutenant colonel spent the remainder of the night in his hunting blind, maintaining vigilant watch for the appearance of the second lion that he knew must be somewhere in the vicinity. The gunshots and commotion of the first kill would certainly have alerted the surviving predator to the presence of a hunter in its territory, and Patterson understood that the surviving lion might attempt to locate and attack its comrade's killer. The night passed without further incident, suggesting that the second lion had chosen discretion over immediate retaliation. As dawn broke over the Tsavo wilderness, Patterson began the difficult task of transporting his kill back to the construction camps. The massive size and weight of the dead lion made this a formidable undertaking that required the assistance of several workers and an improvised sledge constructed from available materials. The lieutenant colonel was determined to bring the entire carcass back to the camps, understanding that visible proof of his success would be essential for restoring the morale of his terrified workforce. The arrival of Patterson and his hunting party at the construction camps with the body of the first man-eating lion created a sensation that exceeded even the lieutenant colonel's expectations. The Indian coolies gathered around the massive carcass in a state of awe and amazement, many of them touching the dead predator to convince themselves that it was really dead. The sight of their tormentor's lifeless form had an immediate and dramatic impact on the morale of the workforce, as men who had been paralyzed by terror for weeks suddenly began to display signs of returning confidence and determination. However, Patterson was careful to remind his workers that only one of the 2 man-eating lions had been killed, and that the surviving predator remained as dangerous as ever. The lieutenant colonel understood that premature celebration could lead to carelessness that might provide the remaining lion with opportunities for another successful attack. The death of the first lion represented a significant victory in the campaign against the man-eaters. But it was only the first step in a campaign that would not be complete until both predators had been eliminated. The psychological impact of Patterson's success extended far beyond the immediate boost to worker morale that resulted from the visible proof that the lions could be killed. The death of the first man-eater had broken the spell of supernatural invincibility that had surrounded the predators and demonstrated that they were, after all, mortal animals that could be defeated through superior planning, courage, and marksmanship. This realization would prove crucial in the weeks ahead as Patterson prepared for the even more challenging task of hunting and killing the second lion that continued to threaten the railway construction project. The death of the first man-eating lion marked a significant turning point in the siege of the Tsavo construction camps. But Patterson understood that his victory was only partial as long as the second predator remained at large. The surviving lion represented an even greater threat than before, as it now possessed the knowledge that humans were actively hunting its kind and would undoubtedly adapt its behavior accordingly. The lieutenant colonel recognized that his success in killing the first lion might actually make the second predator more dangerous, as it would combine its existing intelligence and cunning with the wariness of an animal that knew it was being hunted. The immediate aftermath of Patterson's hunting success brought a temporary respite to the construction camps that allowed the lieutenant colonel to reassess his strategy and prepare for the next phase of his campaign. The visible proof that the man-eating lions could be killed had restored some measure of confidence to the Indian coolies, though many remained deeply skeptical about their ultimate chances of survival in what they continued to regard as a demon-haunted wilderness. Patterson's examination of the dead lion provided valuable intelligence about the nature and capabilities of the predators that had terrorized his workforce for weeks. The massive size and physical adaptations of the first lion confirmed that both predators were extraordinary specimens that had evolved beyond the normal parameters of their species. The battle scars and old wounds that marked the carcass suggested that these lions had been engaged in violent conflicts for years, developing the intelligence and wariness that had made them such formidable adversaries. Most significantly, Patterson's analysis of the first lion's stomach contents revealed the horrifying extent of the predator's success in hunting human prey. The remains found within the animal's digestive system provided evidence that it had consumed at least 28 people during its career as a man-eater, a number that far exceeded the known victims from the railway construction camps. This discovery suggested that the lions had been preying on local tribal populations for years before turning their attention to the railway workers, establishing a pattern of human predation that had claimed hundreds of lives throughout the Tsavo region. The knowledge that he was facing a surviving predator with such an extensive record of successful human hunting weighed heavily on Patterson's mind as he planned his next hunting campaign. The second lion would possess all the experience and cunning of its dead companion, combined with the additional wariness that came from knowing that humans were actively seeking to kill it. The lieutenant colonel understood that hunting the surviving predator would require even greater skill, patience, and courage than the campaign that had resulted in the death of the first lion. Patterson's strategy for hunting the second lion was based on the assumption that the surviving predator would alter its behavior patterns in response to the death of its companion. The lieutenant colonel expected the lion to become more cautious and unpredictable, avoiding the feeding grounds and travel routes that it had previously used with confidence. This adaptation would make the passive hunting techniques that had proven successful against the first lion inadequate for dealing with a more wary and intelligent adversary. Instead of waiting in ambush at known feeding grounds, Patterson decided to adopt a more aggressive approach that would involve tracking the second lion to its lair and engaging it in its own territory. This strategy was extremely dangerous, as it would require the hunter to enter the dense bush where the lion possessed every advantage of terrain and concealment. However, the lieutenant colonel believed that this aggressive approach offered the best chance of locating and killing a predator that would no longer expose itself at predictable times and locations. Patterson's preparations for the tracking campaign were more extensive than any he had previously undertaken, reflecting his understanding that he would be entering the most dangerous phase of his hunting career. The lieutenant colonel assembled a team of experienced local guides who possessed intimate knowledge of the Tsavo wilderness and the behavior patterns of the region's wildlife. These men understood the subtle signs and tracks that would be necessary to follow the second lion through terrain that favored the predator over its human pursuers. The tracking team was equipped with the most powerful weapons available to the railway construction project, including several heavy rifles capable of stopping charging lions at close range. Patterson also ensured that the team carried adequate medical supplies and emergency equipment, understanding that injuries were likely during a campaign that would involve close-quarters encounters with one of the most dangerous predators in Africa. Most importantly, the team was trained in the tactics and procedures necessary for coordinated action against a lion that might attack from any direction without warning. The first tracking expedition began at dawn on May 8th, with Patterson leading his team toward the rocky hills where the reconnaissance missions had identified the lion's primary den. The approach to this area required careful navigation through some of the most difficult terrain in the region, where thorny vegetation and unstable rock formations created numerous opportunities for ambush by a waiting predator. The team moved with extreme caution, maintaining constant vigilance for any sign of the surviving lion, while following the faint tracks and other evidence that marked its passage through the wilderness. The den complex that served as the lion's primary refuge was located in a series of interconnected caves that had been carved by centuries of water erosion in the rocky hillside. The caves provided ideal concealment and security for the predators, with multiple entrances and escape routes that would make any direct assault extremely dangerous for human attackers. Patterson's examination of the site revealed clear evidence of recent lion activity, including fresh tracks and the remains of previous kills that had been dragged into the caves for consumption. However, the caves were empty when Patterson's team conducted their initial reconnaissance, suggesting that the surviving lion had abandoned its primary refuge in response to the death of its companion. This discovery confirmed the lieutenant colonel's assessment that the second predator possessed the intelligence to adapt its behavior patterns in response to changing circumstances. The surviving lion had apparently recognized that its traditional stronghold was no longer secure and had relocated to alternative refuges that would be unknown to its human pursuers. The search for the second lion's new hiding place required Patterson and his team to expand their reconnaissance activities throughout the vast wilderness that surrounded the construction camps. This effort was complicated by the density of the vegetation and the numerous potential hiding places that the terrain provided for a cunning predator. The tracking team followed every possible lead, examining game trails, water sources, and other locations where the lion might have established a new refuge. After 3 days of intensive searching, Patterson's team discovered evidence of the second lion's presence at a location more than 5 miles from the original den site. Fresh tracks and kill remains indicated that the predator had established a new territory in an area of particularly dense bush that provided excellent concealment and multiple escape routes. The new refuge was located near a seasonal water source that would attract prey animals, providing the lion with hunting opportunities that did not require it to venture near the railway construction camps. The discovery of the second lion's new territory presented Patterson with a tactical challenge that tested every aspect of his hunting experience and military training. The terrain strongly favored the predator, with thick vegetation that would limit visibility and restrict the movement of human hunters while providing perfect concealment for a stalking lion. The multiple escape routes meant that the predator could retreat to safety at the first sign of danger, making it extremely difficult to corner the animal in a position where it could be engaged effectively. Patterson's solution to this tactical challenge involved the implementation of a coordinated tracking campaign that would pressure the lion from multiple directions simultaneously. The lieutenant colonel divided his team into smaller groups that would approach the predator's new territory from different angles, creating a net that would gradually tighten around the lion while limiting its opportunities for escape. This strategy required precise coordination and timing to ensure that the various teams could support each other if the lion attacked one of the groups. The coordinated tracking campaign began on May 12, with Patterson's teams moving into position around the second lion's territory during the early morning hours when the predator would presumably be resting after its nocturnal hunting activities. The teams maintained radio communication using a primitive signaling system based on bird calls and other natural sounds that would not alert the lion to their presence. Each team was equipped with powerful rifles and emergency flares that could be used to summon assistance if they encountered the predator. The first indication that the coordinated approach was having an effect came when one of the tracking teams discovered fresh lion tracks moving away from the center of the territory toward an area where no escape routes were available. The tracks suggested that the predator was being pushed toward a box canyon where it could be cornered and engaged under conditions that would favor the human hunters. Patterson immediately directed his other teams to adjust their positions to ensure that the lion could not backtrack or find alternative escape routes. As the net continued to tighten around the second lion's position, Patterson found himself facing the most dangerous phase of his hunting campaign. The surviving predator was being forced into an increasingly desperate situation, where it would have no choice but to fight rather than flee. The lieutenant colonel understood that a cornered lion represented the ultimate test of a hunter's skill and courage, as the animal would attack with the fury of a creature that had nothing left to lose. The stage was set for a final confrontation between human determination and animal desperation that would determine the ultimate fate of the railway construction project and the lives of every man involved in the campaign against the Tsavo man-eaters. Patterson's coordinated tracking strategy had succeeded in locating and pressuring the second lion, but the most dangerous phase of the hunt was yet to come as the predator prepared to make its final stand against the humans who had invaded its domain. The culmination of Patterson's campaign against the man-eating lions approached with the inexorability of a tropical storm, as the coordinated tracking operation gradually forced the second predator into an increasingly desperate situation from which there could be no escape. The lieutenant colonel understood that the surviving lion, now deprived of its traditional refuges and hunting grounds, would soon be compelled to make a final stand that would determine the outcome of the entire struggle for control of the Tsavo region. The narrow entrance to the canyon could be easily controlled by a small number of armed men, while the rocky walls provided concealment and elevated shooting positions that would give the human hunters significant advantages over their quarry. Most importantly, the canyon offered no escape routes that would allow the lion to retreat and continue its reign of terror from another location. Patterson's final preparations for the climactic encounter reflected his understanding that he was about to face the most dangerous moment of his entire hunting career. The surviving lion had demonstrated intelligence and cunning that exceeded even that of its dead companion, and the desperate circumstances in which it now found itself would make it even more unpredictable and aggressive than usual. The lieutenant colonel equipped himself with his most reliable weapons and took personal command of the team that would enter the canyon to locate and engage the cornered predator. The approach to the canyon began in the pre-dawn darkness of May 15th, with Patterson leading a carefully selected team of his most experienced men toward what would almost certainly be their final encounter with the Tsavo man-eaters. The team moved with the silent precision of veteran soldiers advancing into combat, each man understanding that their survival depended on perfect coordination and split-second timing during the battle that lay ahead. The entrance to the canyon was marked by massive boulders that had fallen from the surrounding cliffs over countless centuries, creating a natural barrier that channeled any approaching predator into a narrow passage where it could be easily observed and engaged. Patterson positioned his men to take advantage of these natural fortifications, establishing overlapping fields of fire that would ensure that the lion could not escape once it had been located within the canyon. The interior of the canyon stretched for approximately 200 yards before terminating in a semicircular wall of solid rock that rose nearly 50 feet above the canyon floor. The walls were lined with caves and crevices that provided numerous hiding places for a cornered predator, while the rocky terrain offered limited visibility and treacherous footing for the human hunters who would be pursuing their quarry through this natural fortress. Patterson's systematic search of the canyon began at the narrow entrance and proceeded methodically toward the dead end at the rear, with the hunting team maintaining careful formation to ensure that no section of the terrain was left unchecked. The lieutenant colonel understood that the lion could be concealed in any of the numerous caves and rock formations that lined the canyon walls, and that a single moment of carelessness could result in a surprise attack that would prove fatal to one or more of his men. The tension within the hunting party increased with each step deeper into the canyon, as the men understood that they were entering the most dangerous phase of an already perilous mission. The rocky walls seemed to close in around them like the jaws of some enormous trap, while the silence was broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the occasional rattle of loose stones displaced by their careful progress through the treacherous terrain. The first sign of the lion's presence came when Patterson discovered fresh tracks in a patch of sandy soil near the center of the canyon. The massive paw prints were clearly visible in the soft earth, indicating that the predator had passed through this area within the past few hours. Most significantly, the tracks led toward a large cave opening in the rear wall of the canyon, suggesting that the lion had taken refuge in the deepest and most defensible position available to it. Patterson's approach to the cave required extreme caution, as the lieutenant colonel understood that he was about to enter the lion's final stronghold, where the predator would have every advantage of terrain and concealment. The cave opening was large enough to accommodate the massive predator while providing limited visibility for any human attempting to peer into its dark interior. The rocky floor of the cave entrance was marked with additional tracks and other signs of recent lion activity that confirmed the predator's presence within. The lieutenant colonel positioned his men to cover all possible escape routes from the cave while he prepared to enter the dark opening and locate the cornered lion. Patterson understood that this moment represented the ultimate test of his courage and hunting skills, as he would be entering a confined space where the lion's superior strength and agility would make it an even more formidable adversary than it had proven in open terrain. Armed with his most powerful rifle and a reliable lantern to illuminate the cave interior, Patterson began his cautious advance into the lion's final refuge. The cave extended much deeper into the rocky hillside than he had anticipated, with the narrow entrance opening into a larger chamber that provided adequate space for a confrontation between hunter and hunted. The beam of his lantern revealed claw marks on the cave walls and the scattered remains of previous kills that testified to the extensive use that the predators had made of this refuge. The second lion was waiting in the deepest recess of the cave, its massive form barely visible in the dim light of Patterson's lantern, until the predator's eyes reflected the illumination like glowing coals in the darkness. The lieutenant colonel found himself face to face with an adversary that seemed even larger and more formidable than its dead companion, a creature that radiated menace and intelligence in equal measure as it prepared for the final confrontation that would determine which species would claim dominance over the Tsavo region. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, hunter and hunted regarded each other across the confines of the cave chamber, each taking the measure of an adversary that represented mortal danger. The lion's intelligence was clearly visible in its eyes, which displayed the calculating awareness of a predator that understood it was facing its final battle but was determined to exact the highest possible price for its defeat. The confrontation exploded into violence with shocking suddenness as the cornered lion launched itself toward Patterson with the desperate fury of a creature that had nothing left to lose. The massive predator covered the distance between them in a single bound, its enormous claws extended and its powerful jaws agape as it sought to destroy the enemy that had hunted it to its final refuge. Patterson's rifle fired at point-blank range just as the lion reached him, the heavy bullet striking the predator in the chest and causing it to stagger under the impact. However, the lion's momentum carried it forward despite the mortal wound, and Patterson found himself engaged in a life-and-death struggle with an adversary that possessed the strength to kill him even as it died from his gunshot. The battle within the cave lasted only seconds, but seemed to continue for hours as Patterson struggled to avoid the lion's claws and teeth while attempting to bring his rifle to bear for a second shot. The confines of the cave prevented either combatant from gaining a decisive advantage, as the rocky walls limited their movement, while the darkness made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Patterson's second shot struck the lion in the head, finally ending the predator's life and bringing the reign of terror that had paralyzed the Tsavo construction camps to a dramatic conclusion. The massive animal collapsed at the lieutenant colonel's feet, its enormous form filling much of the available space within the cave chamber. The sudden silence that followed the lion's death was almost as shocking as the violence that had preceded it, leaving Patterson stunned by the realization that he had finally succeeded in eliminating both of the man-eating predators that had threatened to destroy the railway construction project. The extraction of the second lion's carcass from the cave required considerable effort and ingenuity, as the massive size and weight of the dead predator made it extremely difficult to maneuver through the narrow cave entrance. Patterson and his men were forced to construct an elaborate system of ropes and pulleys to drag the lion's body from its final refuge, a process that required several hours of strenuous labor under difficult conditions. The return journey to the construction camps with the body of the second lion created an even greater sensation than had accompanied the arrival of the first predator's carcass. The Indian coolies gathered around the massive animal in a state of awe and celebration, many of them touching the dead lion to convince themselves that their long ordeal was finally over. The sight of both man-eaters lying dead side by side had an immediate and dramatic impact on the morale of the workforce, as men who had been paralyzed by terror for months suddenly began to display signs of returning confidence and determination. Patterson's measurement and examination of the second lion revealed that it was even larger than its companion, measuring over 9.5 feet from nose to tail and weighing an estimated 450 pounds. Like the first lion, the second predator showed clear evidence of having survived numerous encounters with human hunters, its hide bearing the scars of old bullet wounds and other injuries that testified to its violent career as a man-eater. The lieutenant colonel's analysis of the second lion's stomach contents provided additional evidence of the extent of the predator's success in hunting human prey. The remains found within the animal's digestive system suggested that it had consumed at least 17 people during its career, bringing the total known human victims of both lions to at least 45 individuals. This number represented only the confirmed kills, and Patterson suspected that the actual death toll was considerably higher when the predator's attacks on local tribal populations were taken into account. The death of the second man-eating lion marked the end of one of the most remarkable hunting campaigns in the history of British colonial Africa. Patterson's success in eliminating both predators had saved the railway construction project from complete collapse and demonstrated that even the most formidable natural adversaries could be defeated through superior planning, courage, and determination. The lieutenant colonel's victory over the Tsavo man-eaters would become legendary throughout the British Empire, establishing his reputation as one of the most skilled and courageous hunters of his generation. However, the immediate priority for Patterson and his men was the resumption of normal railway construction activities and the completion of the bridge that would carry the Uganda Railway across the Tsavo River. The death of the man-eating lions had lifted the siege that had paralyzed the construction camps for months, but significant work remained to be done if the project was to meet its scheduled completion date and fulfill the imperial ambitions that had brought British civilization to this remote corner of East Africa. The elimination of both man-eating lions marked the beginning of a dramatic transformation in the atmosphere of the Tsavo construction camps that was as remarkable as the reign of terror that had preceded it. Within days of Patterson's return with the body of the second predator, the paralyzed railway construction project began to show signs of renewed life as the Indian coolies gradually overcame their terror and returned to the demanding work of building the bridge that would carry the Uganda Railway across the Tsavo River. The psychological impact of seeing both lions lying dead was immediate and profound, as the visible proof of their mortality finally convinced the most superstitious workers that they were dealing with flesh and blood predators rather than supernatural demons. The lieutenant colonel arranged for both carcasses to remain on display for several days, allowing every member of the workforce to examine the massive animals and satisfy themselves that the threat that had terrorized them for months had been permanently eliminated. Patterson's detailed examination of both lions provided fascinating insights into the nature and capabilities of the predators that had brought the railway construction project to the brink of collapse. The combined weight of the two animals exceeded 800 pounds, making them among the largest lions ever recorded in East Africa. Their maneless appearance, initially so unsettling to observers accustomed to the magnificent manes of typical male lions, was revealed to be an adaptation to the thorny vegetation of the Tsavo region that would have made traditional manes a significant disadvantage during hunting activities. Most remarkably, both lions showed evidence of dental abnormalities that helped explain their preference for human prey over the traditional game animals that formed the usual diet of their species. Broken and damaged teeth would have made it extremely difficult for the predators to bring down large antelope and other swift prey animals, forcing them to seek easier targets that could be killed with less physical effort. Human beings, with their relatively slow movement and poor sensory capabilities compared to traditional prey species, represented ideal victims for predators that could no longer hunt with the efficiency typical of healthy lions. The lieutenant colonel's analysis of the extensive scarring on both animals revealed that they had been engaged in violent encounters for years before turning their attention to the railway construction camps. Old bullet wounds and other injuries testified to numerous conflicts with human hunters, encounters that had apparently taught the lions to view people as both prey and enemy. This combination of hunger driven by dental problems and learned aggression toward humans had created predators that were uniquely adapted for the systematic hunting of people. The reconstruction of the lions' hunting territory revealed the scope and sophistication of their operations against human targets throughout the Tsavo region. Evidence gathered from local tribal sources indicated that the predators had been responsible for hundreds of deaths among the indigenous population over a period of several years, establishing a pattern of human predation that had claimed far more victims than the railway construction workers who had attracted international attention to their activities. The elaborate tunnel system that had enabled the lions to penetrate the defensive measures around the construction camps was revealed to be even more extensive than Patterson had initially realized. Further investigation uncovered a network of underground passages that extended for hundreds of yards in all directions from the main camps, representing months or possibly years of excavation work that demonstrated planning and engineering capabilities that approached those of human military engineers. Patterson's preservation of the lion's skins represented a decision that would ensure the permanent commemoration of his remarkable hunting achievement and provide future generations with tangible evidence of the extraordinary predators that had terrorized the Tsavo region. The lieutenant colonel arranged for the careful removal and treatment of both hides, ensuring that they would be preserved in a condition that accurately reflected the massive size and formidable appearance of the man-eating lions. The resumption of normal construction activities proceeded with remarkable speed as the Indian coolies threw themselves into their work with an enthusiasm born of relief and gratitude for their deliverance from the terror that had paralyzed them for months. The bridge construction that had been virtually halted during the siege advanced rapidly as the workers made up for lost time with energy and determination that exceeded even their pre-crisis productivity levels. Patterson found that his relationship with the Indian workforce had been fundamentally transformed by his success in eliminating the man-eating lions. The coolies who had previously regarded him as simply another British officer now viewed him as a protector and savior who had risked his own life to ensure their safety. This enhanced respect and loyalty would prove invaluable in the challenging work that remained to complete the bridge construction and advance the railway toward its ultimate destination in Uganda. The lieutenant colonel's own perspective on the construction project had been similarly transformed by his experiences during the siege of the construction camps. The successful completion of the bridge represented more than simply an engineering achievement. It had become a symbol of human determination and technological progress triumphing over the natural forces that sought to prevent the advance of civilization into the African wilderness. The bridge construction itself presented formidable engineering challenges that tested every aspect of Patterson's technical expertise and management skills. The Tsavo River, though not particularly wide during the dry season, was subject to dramatic flooding during the periodic rains that transformed the normally placid watercourse into a raging torrent capable of destroying inadequately designed structures. The bridge would need to be built to withstand these seasonal variations while supporting the weight of fully loaded trains carrying goods and passengers between the coast and the interior. The foundation work for the bridge required extensive excavation in the rocky riverbed and the precise placement of massive stone piers that would support the weight of the iron superstructure. This work was complicated by the need to complete the underwater construction during the dry season, when the river level was at its lowest and access to the foundation sites was possible. The timing constraints meant that any delays could result in the foundation work being interrupted by flooding that would set the entire project back by months. The iron components of the bridge superstructure had been manufactured in Britain and transported to the construction site over hundreds of miles of difficult terrain by human porters and ox-drawn wagons. The assembly of these prefabricated sections required precise engineering and careful coordination of the various construction crews, as each component had to be positioned with millimeter accuracy to ensure the structural integrity of the finished bridge. Patterson's management of the bridge construction demonstrated the leadership skills and technical expertise that had earned him his position as chief engineer of the railway project. The lieutenant colonel coordinated the activities of hundreds of workers while simultaneously ensuring that the various technical requirements of the project were met according to the highest standards of British engineering practice. His ability to maintain quality control while working under the challenging conditions of the African frontier reflected the professional competence that characterized the best officers of the British colonial service. The completion of the bridge foundation work was achieved ahead of schedule, as the renewed enthusiasm of the workforce more than compensated for the time that had been lost during the siege of the construction camps. The Indian coolies worked with remarkable dedication and efficiency, understanding that their successful completion of the project would represent a triumph over the natural forces that had sought to prevent their achievement of this engineering milestone. The installation of the iron superstructure proceeded with equal success, as Patterson's careful planning and coordination ensured that each component was positioned correctly and securely fastened to create a structure that would withstand the demanding conditions of service on the Uganda Railway. The site of the bridge taking shape over the Tsavo River provided visible evidence of the progress that was being made toward the completion of the railway project and the achievement of the imperial ambitions that had motivated the construction of this remarkable transportation link. As the bridge neared completion, Patterson began to receive messages of congratulation and recognition from his superiors in Nairobi and London, acknowledging both his engineering achievements and his success in eliminating the man-eating lions that had threatened to destroy the entire project. The lieutenant colonel's combination of technical expertise and hunting prowess had saved the railway construction effort and demonstrated the qualities of leadership and determination that exemplified the best traditions of British colonial service. The preservation and ultimate disposition of the lion's skins became a matter of considerable interest to natural history institutions and museums throughout the British Empire. Patterson's careful documentation of the predator's extraordinary size and capabilities had attracted the attention of scientists and researchers who recognized the historical significance of these remarkable specimens. The lieutenant colonel's decision to preserve the skins would ensure that future generations would have tangible evidence of the man-eating lions that had terrorized the Tsavo region and the remarkable hunting campaign that had eliminated them. The completion of the Tsavo River Bridge in the autumn of 1898 marked not only the end of a crucial phase in the construction of the Uganda Railway, but also the culmination of one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of British colonial Africa. Patterson's dual achievement as both engineer and hunter had saved the railway project from complete collapse while establishing his reputation as one of the most remarkable figures of the imperial frontier. The lieutenant colonel's success in eliminating the man-eating lions had demonstrated that even the most formidable natural adversaries could be defeated through superior planning, courage, and determination. The railway bridge itself stood as a testament to British engineering prowess and imperial ambition, its iron spans carrying the promise of modern transportation across one of the last untamed regions of the African continent. The structure that had cost so much in human suffering and struggle represented far more than a simple transportation link. It symbolized the triumph of human civilization over the primitive forces that had sought to prevent the advance of progress into the heart of Africa. Patterson's careful documentation of his encounters with the man-eating lions ensured that the extraordinary events at Tsavo would be preserved for future generations to study and appreciate. The lieutenant colonel's detailed records of the predator's behavior, physical characteristics, and hunting methods provided valuable scientific data that contributed to the understanding of lion behavior and the rare phenomenon of man-eating among large carnivores. These records would prove invaluable to researchers and wildlife experts for decades to come. The terror they had inspired had threatened to derail one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in the history of the British Empire, potentially setting back the development of East Africa by years or even decades. Patterson's success in eliminating the predators had saved not only individual lives, but also the imperial ambitions that depended on the successful completion of the Uganda Railway. The preservation of the lion's skins represented Patterson's determination to ensure that tangible evidence of these extraordinary predators would survive for future study and display. The lieutenant colonel understood that the massive size and unusual characteristics of the man-eaters made them specimens of exceptional scientific and historical value. His careful treatment of the hides ensured that they would retain their impressive appearance and provide accurate representations of the formidable adversaries he had faced during his hunting campaign. The transportation of the preserved lion skins from Tsavo to their ultimate destination represented a journey that would carry them from the African wilderness to the heart of American scientific institutions. Patterson's decision to donate the specimens to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago reflected his understanding of the international significance of the Tsavo man-eaters and his desire to ensure that they would be displayed in an institution capable of providing them with the scientific attention they deserved. The arrival of the lion skins at the Field Museum created a sensation that extended far beyond the scientific community to capture the imagination of the general public throughout America and Europe. The massive size of the preserved specimens and the dramatic story of their elimination by a single hunter resonated with popular fascination for tales of adventure and heroism on the imperial frontier. The man-eating lions of Tsavo became symbols of the wild Africa that was rapidly disappearing under the advance of European colonization and technological development. The museum's taxidermists faced the challenging task of mounting the lion skins in a manner that would accurately convey the formidable appearance and massive size of the living predators. The careful reconstruction of the animals' forms required detailed consultation with Patterson and other witnesses who had observed the lions during their reign of terror at Tsavo. The resulting museum displays would provide visitors with an impressive representation of the most famous man-eating lions in recorded history. The scientific study of the Tsavo lions' remains provided valuable insights into the factors that had contributed to their extraordinary size and aggressive behavior toward humans. Analysis of their skulls and teeth confirmed the presence of dental abnormalities that would have made traditional hunting extremely difficult, supporting Patterson's theory that physical disabilities had forced the predators to seek easier prey among human populations. These findings contributed to the understanding of the conditions that could lead normal lions to become man-eaters. The behavioral patterns exhibited by the Tsavo lions during their attacks on the railway construction camps provided researchers with unprecedented data about the intelligence and adaptability of large carnivores under pressure. The predator's ability to overcome elaborate defensive measures and their apparent coordination in hunting activities demonstrated cognitive capabilities that exceeded those typically associated with lions. These observations would influence scientific understanding of carnivore behavior for decades to come. The sophisticated engineering of the underground passages that had enabled the predators to penetrate the defenses of the construction camps suggested planning and execution capabilities that approached those of human military engineers. This extraordinary behavior challenged existing assumptions about the cognitive limitations of non-human predators. Patterson's own account of his experiences at Tsavo became one of the most popular adventure narratives of the late Victorian era, capturing the imagination of readers throughout the British Empire and beyond. The lieutenant colonel's combination of technical expertise and hunting prowess made him an ideal representative of the imperial ideal, while his dramatic encounters with the man-eating lions provided the kind of thrilling adventure story that appealed to contemporary fascination with frontier heroism. The near collapse of the railway construction project had demonstrated the vulnerability of imperial infrastructure to natural threats and the importance of adequate preparation for the challenges of African frontier development. Future colonial projects would incorporate lessons learned from Patterson's experiences in dealing with dangerous wildlife and hostile environmental conditions. The success of the Uganda Railway itself vindicated the vision of those who had conceived and promoted the project, despite its enormous costs and the numerous challenges that had threatened its completion. The transportation link between the coast and the interior opened up vast regions of East Africa to European influence and economic development, fundamentally transforming the political and economic landscape of the region. The railway that had nearly been destroyed by two man-eating lions became one of the most important factors in the establishment of British hegemony in East Africa. The local African population's relationship with the railway project was complex and multifaceted, reflecting both the benefits and disruptions that accompanied the advance of European technology and administration. The elimination of the man-eating lions that had terrorized local communities for years was universally welcomed, while the economic opportunities created by the railway provided new sources of employment and trade. However, the fundamental transformation of traditional ways of life that accompanied colonial development created tensions that would persist for generations. The environmental impact of the railway construction through the Tsavo region represented part of a broader pattern of ecological change that accompanied European colonization throughout Africa. The clearance of vegetation for the railway line and the associated infrastructure development disrupted traditional migration patterns of wildlife and altered the ecological balance that had existed in the region for centuries. These changes would have far-reaching consequences for the wildlife populations and natural systems of East Africa. The fame of the Tsavo man-eaters ensured that their story would be retold and reinterpreted by successive generations of writers, filmmakers, and popular historians. The dramatic nature of Patterson's hunting campaign and the extraordinary characteristics of his adversaries provided material for countless adventure stories that would shape popular perceptions of Africa and colonial heroism for decades to come. The man-eating lions became archetypal symbols of the wild and dangerous Africa that European explorers and administrators claimed to have conquered through superior courage and technology. The preservation of the Tsavo lions in the Field Museum represented more than simple scientific collection. It symbolized the capture and domestication of African wildness for the education and entertainment of civilized audiences. The museum displays that presented the mounted lions to American and international visitors reinforced contemporary narratives about the triumph of human civilization over natural savagery, while simultaneously preserving tangible evidence of the remarkable predators that had briefly challenged the advance of imperial progress. The scientific legacy of the Tsavo man-eaters extended far beyond their immediate historical significance to influence research into carnivore behavior, human-wildlife conflict, and the factors that contribute to man-eating behavior among large predators. Modern researchers continue to study the preserved specimens and historical records to gain insights into the complex interactions between environmental pressure, physical disability, and behavioral adaptation that can transform normal predators into specialized hunters of human prey. The dramatic confrontation between Patterson and the lions represents an archetypal narrative of heroic struggle against seemingly supernatural adversaries, a story that resonates with fundamental human anxieties about our relationship with the natural world and our ability to control and civilize the forces of wildness that surround us. More than a century has passed since Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson fired the shots that ended the reign of terror imposed by the man-eating lions of Tsavo, yet the story of these extraordinary predators continues to capture the imagination of new generations around the world. The preserved remains of the lions, now permanently displayed in the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, serve as tangible links to one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of human-wildlife conflict and the expansion of British imperial power in East Africa. The museum displays that house the Tsavo lions have undergone numerous modifications and improvements over the decades, incorporating new scientific understanding of lion behavior and the historical context of the railway construction project that brought Patterson into conflict with these formidable predators. Modern museum techniques have enabled curators to present the lions in more lifelike poses that better convey the power and menace that made them such effective hunters of human prey during their brief but devastating career. Contemporary visitors to the Field Museum encounter the Tsavo lions as part of elaborate exhibits that place their story within the broader context of African wildlife conservation and the complex legacy of European colonialism on the African continent. The displays acknowledge both the genuine terror that the lions inspired among the railway workers and the broader environmental and social disruptions that accompanied the construction of the Uganda Railway through the traditional territories of East African peoples and wildlife. Scientific analysis of the preserved lion specimens has continued to yield new insights into the factors that contributed to their extraordinary size, unusual appearance, and preference for human prey. Modern techniques of forensic examination and genetic analysis have confirmed many of Patterson's original observations about the physical abnormalities that may have driven these predators to seek easier targets among human populations rather than pursuing traditional prey species. The dental pathology exhibited by both lions has been studied extensively by researchers seeking to understand the relationship between physical disability and behavioral adaptation among large carnivores. The severe tooth damage and gum disease that affected both predators would have made normal hunting extremely painful and inefficient, providing a compelling explanation for their turn toward human prey that could be killed with less physical stress and effort. Recent research into the environmental conditions of the Tsavo region during the 1890s has revealed additional factors that may have contributed to the lions' unusual behavior and extraordinary success as man-eaters. Drought conditions and disease outbreaks among traditional prey species had reduced the availability of natural food sources, forcing predators throughout the region to seek alternative sources of nutrition. The concentration of railway workers in the construction camps provided an unprecedented opportunity for predators willing and able to exploit this new food source. The legacy of the Uganda Railway itself reflects the complex and often contradictory impacts of colonial infrastructure development on African societies and environments. While the railway undoubtedly facilitated economic development and provided new opportunities for trade and communication, it also disrupted traditional ways of life and contributed to the marginalization of indigenous populations throughout East Africa. The triumph of British engineering over the man-eating lions represented only one aspect of a much broader transformation that would reshape the entire region. Modern conservation efforts in the Tsavo region acknowledge the area's historical significance while working to protect the wildlife populations that continue to inhabit this challenging environment. The Tsavo National Parks, established decades after Patterson's hunting campaign, preserve vast areas of the ecosystem that once supported the man-eating lions and continue to provide habitat for their descendants and other large carnivores. The ongoing challenges of human-wildlife conflict in East Africa echo many of the issues that Patterson faced during his confrontation with the man-eating lions. Expanding human populations and agricultural development continue to bring people into contact with large predators, creating situations that require careful management to protect both human communities and wildlife populations. The lessons learned from Patterson's experience at Tsavo continue to inform modern approaches to these complex conservation challenges. The popular culture legacy of the Tsavo man-eaters has ensured that their story remains familiar to audiences throughout the world, though often in versions that emphasize dramatic entertainment over historical accuracy. Films, books, and other media have repeatedly returned to the basic narrative of Patterson's hunting campaign, usually emphasizing the supernatural aspects of the lion's behavior while downplaying the broader historical context of colonial development and environmental disruption. Bus. The scientific significance of the Tsavo lions extends beyond their individual characteristics to encompass broader questions about the evolution of carnivore behavior and the factors that can lead to the development of specialized hunting strategies. The coordinated hunting techniques exhibited by these predators and their apparent ability to modify their environment through tunnel construction represent extreme examples of behavioral adaptation that continue to challenge conventional understanding of carnivore capabilities. Educational programs associated with the Field Museum's lion displays have introduced countless students and visitors to the story of the Tsavo man-eaters, while promoting broader understanding of African wildlife conservation and the complex legacies of colonial history. The lions serve as effective focal points for discussions of human-wildlife conflict, conservation biology, and the environmental impacts of large-scale development projects. The preservation of Patterson's own detailed records and photographs from the Tsavo period has provided historians and researchers with an unusually complete documentation of a significant episode in colonial African history. These primary sources continue to be consulted by scholars studying various aspects of the railway construction project, the behavior of the man-eating lions, and the broader patterns of British colonial administration in East Africa. Modern DNA analysis of samples from the preserved lion specimens has revealed genetic information that provides insights into the evolutionary history and population structure of East African lion populations. This research has contributed to broader understanding of lion evolution and genetics while providing specific information about the ancestry and relationships of the famous Tsavo man-eaters. The enduring fascination with the Tsavo lions reflects fundamental human interests in stories of conflict between civilization and wildness, order and chaos, technology and nature. The dramatic narrative of Patterson's hunting campaign represents an archetypal tale of heroic struggle against seemingly supernatural adversaries, a story that continues to resonate with contemporary audiences despite the vast changes that have occurred in our understanding of wildlife conservation and colonial history. The man-eating lions of Tsavo have achieved a form of immortality through their preservation in the Field Museum and their permanent place in the annals of human-wildlife conflict. More than a century after their deaths at the hands of Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, these extraordinary predators continue to inspire awe, terror, and fascination among new generations of visitors who encounter their preserved forms in the climate-controlled galleries of one of America's premier natural history institutions. The story of the Tsavo man-eaters serves as a reminder of the power of individual animals to impact human history and the complex relationships that exist between human development and wildlife conservation. Patterson's successful campaign against these formidable predators represented a crucial moment in the expansion of British imperial power in East Africa, while the lions themselves became symbols of the wild Africa that was rapidly disappearing under the advance of European colonization and technological development. In death, the man-eating lions of Tsavo have achieved a significance that extends far beyond their brief but devastating impact on the railway construction project that brought them into conflict with human civilization. Their preserved remains continue to serve as tangible links to a vanished world of colonial adventure and African wildness, while their story provides enduring lessons about courage, determination, and the complex relationships between humans and the natural world that surrounds us. The legacy of Lieutenant Colonel Patterson's triumph over the man-eating lions ensures that this remarkable episode in colonial African history will continue to be remembered and retold for generations to come. The preserved lions in the Field Museum stand as permanent monuments to one of the most extraordinary confrontations between human determination and animal cunning in recorded history, their massive forms bearing silent testimony to the terror they once inspired and the courage required to eliminate them from the African wilderness they had made their own.